Hey everyone, it's me, and I'm not gonna lie, I'm still trembling from what I uncovered. I just wrapped up hours of scouring Texas night beats, and today I'm bringing you 20 jaw-dropping, true accounts from real Texas police. Officers who quit on the spot after what they saw in the darkness. I promise, after just one of these stories, you'll think twice before calling 911 after sundown. If your skin's already crawling, do yourself a favor, hit subscribe now, because once you join Creepy Vibes, you'll never want to miss a single siren or shadow that crosses your screen. Before we dive in, drop a comment, where are you watching from, and what time is it on your clock right now? Let me know and brace yourself, because these 20 real encounters will make every midnight patrol feel like walking into a nightmare. Let's get into 20 real Texas police officers who quit after what they saw at night. I'd never believed in ghosts until that night in Bay City. The sugarcane fields stretch so far you can't see the end of them, a jungle of green stalks taller than a man, rustling in a breeze you can't feel. I was the only patrolman on duty, Officer Luis Hernandez, and the radio crackled like something alive in my hand. They'd called me out for a stalled tractor, left by its operator down a dirt track off FM 522. I figured I'd roll in, give a tow, and be back at headquarters before midnight. Then I heard her dot. It started as a distant sob, a low keening carried on the night wind. I parked the cruiser where the road narrowed, engine idling so I could hear better. The moon hung high but thin, like a slice of silver pressed into the sky. The field looked black past the gravel shoulder, and I clicked on my flashlight. Its beams skated over swaying canes, spotlighting insects that gleamed like coals. I stepped off the road, radio in one hand, flashlight in the other. My boots crunched the gravel, then settled into soft earth that smelled of damp stalks and something sweeter, rotting cane. Maybe the wail came again, sharper this time, a woman's voice. So raw you felt it in your teeth. I froze. No chance it was wind or cattle, they can't mimic pain like that. Dispatch, I whispered into the mic. This is Hernandez. I'm in the sugar cane field by the old tractor. I think there's someone out here. My heart pounded. The radio droned static. Then, help me, it crackled in my own voice. My blood ran cold. That wasn't me. I knew I hadn't screamed. I hadn't even yelled. The voice came through in panic, as if I were trapped beneath a collapsed porch, gouged and bleeding. I spun toward the row where the sound last echoed. My light caught broken stalks, torn leaves. A foot sunk in mud, no footprints though, only indentations like fingertips pressed against the earth. I swallowed, mouth dry, and moved deeper. The canes formed a corridor on either side, shadows, turning to shapes that might be men with guns, might be vultures, might be nothing. I told myself I was being a cop. Investigate first, run later. I clicked the radio off so I wouldn't hear my voice begging. By the time I reached where the tractor sat, tires half buried, cab door open like a mouth, I almost laughed at the absurdity. No machine could make that anguished noise. No living thing stood in that pale circle of light. Then the wind died. The stalks stopped rustling. Silence in that field was like drowning in lead. My breath hitched. I scanned left and right. No one. Without warning, my flashlight flickered, strobing bright then dark. In that heartbeat of blackout, I felt something. A presence at my back, close enough to feel the heat off its skin, the brush of its breath. I snapped the light back. On and swung. Nothing. But in the beam's arc I saw it, shoulders hunched, coat dark as oil, eyes glinting at the edge of focus. The thing stepped forward, tall and thin, limbs too long, fingers tapering into black points. Its mouth stretched into a grin that fractured bone. I raised my radio, thumb shaking. Hernandez to dispatch backup needed. Static swallowed the words. The thing tilted its head, listening. Then it mimicked my voice, low and slurred. "Help me." I stumbled backward, heart pounding so hard I saw stars. My baton felt useless in my belt. I took off running, stumbling over cane debris, the field alive with snapping stalks as if the plants themselves reached for me. The thing followed without sound, each step too smooth to be human. I burst onto the gravel road, adrenaline burning. In my blood. I fumbled with the cruiser door, threw myself inside, slammed it shut. Hands shaking, I locked the doors, chest heaving. Radio to my mouth. "Dispatch. Dispatch. Get someone out here." My words cut short as the engine died. Lights flickering off. The world outside went black, and that airless quiet crawled in. Then through the windshield, I saw her, a woman in a white dress, standing in the road. Her arms hung limp. Her hair was black and tangled, face pale with empty eyes. She lifted one finger to her lips. I dared not scream. Instead, I gunned the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. I pressed the horn, it tooted once, then filled the car with her wail, the same maddening cry. It rattled my skull. My head snapped up. The woman was gone. In her place, pressed against the glass, was a palm print, smeared with something dark and wet. I lashed at the door with my fist. Glass cracked. I shoved the wheel, tried the handle again. It snapped open with a crunch of metal. I dove out and ran without looking back. The cornfield swallowed me. I heard the whisper of my name, the thing calling after me, voice like gravel in a throat. I ran so long my lungs burned. I kept running until the canes ended and I hit pavement at the county line. They found me the next morning curled beside the road, uniform in tatters, eyes wild. My radio lay 10 feet away, static humming. When they asked what happened, I told them about the woman, the stalks, the thing that looked like me crying for help. They looked at my hands clawed, filthy, stained black under the nails. I didn't. Go back to the station. I didn't fill out a report. I resigned on the spot. Nobody's been back to that field since. They say the tractor's still there, half buried, abandoned. Sometimes at night you can hear her wail drifting across the fields, cutting through the trees, begging for help no one's alive enough to answer. They say if you tune your radio right, you can hear a panic scream that isn't your own. But I don't listen anymore. I quit. I'm done with haunting things. Yet I can't shake the memory of those empty eyes or the grin that wasn't human. And when the wind picks up in the cane, I still hear her, "Help me," and I wonder who's out there, lost in the stalks, screaming alone. The wind had a hollow edge to it that night, skimming across the blacktop of Highway 59 like a blade. Deputy Marisol Vega sat in the driver's seat of her cruiser, the engine's purr a comfort against the emptiness beyond her windshield. She'd been on the late shift for nearly 8 hours, her coffee long gone cold in a styrofoam cup bouncing in the cup holder. The highway stretched before her, 2 lanes disappearing into distant dark, flanked by fields with the tall sorghum. Bent in the breeze, whispering secrets she didn't want to hear, she eased the cruiser forward, eyes scanning for anything out of place tire tracks, a disabled vehicle, discarded bottles glinting in her headlights. That stretch of road was notorious for litter, but tonight something else caught her eye. A pile of gleaming metal fragments scattered across her lane. She braked hard, tires screaming, and pulled over to the shoulder, heart pinging against her ribs. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped into the wind, its chill seeping through her uniform. The debris looked like shards of something dark and polished, twisted as if by fire. No sooner had she knelt to examine the pieces than she heard the titas. Engine behind her rev, she spun, flashlight beam cutting through the night to reveal her patrol car, its lights off rolling past her at speed. The door remained closed, No driver inside. Marisol froze, spine stiff. Her breath hitched, misting in the air. She dashed back to her cruiser, fumbling the radio mic against her chest. "Dispatch, this is Vega. My unit's gone rogue on me." "It's static." A faint sob mingled with the crackle, so soft she thought she'd imagined it. She lunged at the door, it unlocked with a click, and she was in, slamming the cruiser into gear. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror and empty. Road where her other car should have been, tires spinning, brakes loose. Then headlights flared behind her mirror, right in her eyes. She stomped the brake and jerked the wheel, but there was no time to think. The impact knocked her helmet off, a sizzling pain blooming in her skull as metal bit into metal. She felt the world tilt, her uniform ripping where the light struck her back. Everything folded into darkness. She came to on her side, rain or sweat stinging her face. The patrol car she'd tried to stop was a twisted cage of steel now, abandoned on the road's edge. Her own cruiser was gone. The radio mic lay on cracked asphalt, its final broadcast a jumble of static and that low, lonely sob. Her vision swam. The highway lights overhead blinked like distant stars. She tried to move her arm. Agony flared from her shoulder. She pressed a hand to her mouth blood. She sucked in air, cold and sharp. The night seemed to close in, the highway unending, the field silent. She forced herself upright, teeth clenched, scanning for any sign of life. The debris was gone, no shards on the road, nothing but gravel. She cursed under her breath and leaned on the patrol car's crumpled hood for support. How had that other car sprinted past her with no one inside? She tried the radio again. "Dispatch, this is Vega. Her voice was a whisper. The static answered. Then a voice, clear and soft, coaxed from the speaker, "Help me." It wasn't her own voice. It was higher, younger, trembling. Then the static swallowed it whole. Rain began, fat drops rattling on the warped steel, plastering her hair to her forehead. She pressed her back to the side of the patrol car, shivering with cold and fear. She knew that stretch of road too well. Nothing for miles but fields and the skeletal remains of old motels long boarded up. No cell service. No backup for at least 10 more minutes if anyone was even answering calls tonight. She gripped her flashlight tightly, the beam flickering, and forced herself to her feet. Step by step, she walked back toward where her cruiser should have been. But the highway had shifted. The double yellow lines branched like a river delta, and the fields looked uncomfortably close. In her rearview mirror, the patrol car's headlights glowed steady and empty. She stopped. The lights dimmed. Then flickered back on. She trained her flashlight on the door handle as it slowly turned. No one moved inside, but whoever or whatever was in there was coming for her. She spun and ran, pulses of fear hammering through her chest. She tripped on gravel, twisting her ankle, embers of pain igniting. She looked back over her shoulder. The cruiser's lights cut through the rain, bearing down on her. She screamed and hauled herself upright, hobbling toward the shadow of the fields. The tall sorghum stalk swayed, parting as if to welcome her. She cast a final glance at the highway. Her cruiser crossed the pavement in 3 long strides, metal, gleaming, brakes shrieking, and struck her again. She hit the ground, world tilting into spinning darkness. When she woke the second time, it was brown, the taste of dirt and blood on her tongue. No rain now, only the dull hum of cicadas. She lay on her back, uniform torn open, her badge cold against her chest. The highway was empty. No cruisers, no debris, nothing but the long stretch of asphalt and the field stretching toward a sunrise. She couldn't yet see. She forced her eyes open, blinking against the glare. She saw a figure standing at the road's edge, a woman in a deputy's uniform, face blurred as if behind steamed glass. "Hello, Deputy Vega." the figure said, voice soft and hollow. The distant sob floated on the breeze again. Marisol tried to speak, but her throat felt thick with asphalt. The figure raised a hand pail, gloved. In that moment Marisol understood. The patrol car had been her, or a mirror of her, a shadow she couldn't catch, twisted by something vast and hungry. In the night, she tried to run, to call for help, but her legs refused. The horizon bled orange as the sun's first light carved the world in half. The figure stepped forward, dry sorghum stalks crunching under her boots. "Thank you for finding me," she whispered, tilting her head. The lips curved into a smile that wasn't human, stretching too wide. Marisol felt a cold dread squeeze her heart. The figure lunged, gloved hands closing around Marisol's wrists with impossible strength. The world narrowed to that smile, stretched too far, teeth gleaming like pale blades. Marisol tried to scream, but only a whisper escaped Dot as the sun rose. The deputies from dispatch finally answered the frantic calls. They found Marisol's cruiser at the edge of the fields, its lights still on, engine idling. There was no sign of the debris she'd reported, no blood on the asphalt, no second cruiser. The radio microphone lay on the shoulder, the last sounds. Imprinted in its memory a slipping static and a sob that wasn't her own. Deputy Marisol Vega was gone. They chalked it up to a tragic accident, a late-night hallucination, maybe even foul play by some passing drifter. But no body was ever found. Sometimes, when the breeze skims across the fields, folks say you can hear a deputy's siren wailing softly in the distance. And if you drive that lonely stretch of Highway 59 at night, you might see a patrol car sprint past you, its door locked, lights off, no one inside. And if you listen closely, you might catch the faintest sob. Sergeant David Clark had learned over 15 years on the force that nothing good ever waited behind a domestic dispute call. Beaumont's August heat sat like a suffocating quilt over the city, humidity pressing the hollows of the soul until it wheezed for relief. His cruisers a sea wheezed back at him, failing under the weight of the day. He'd answered dozens of these shouting matches, smacked dishes, slamming doors. Usually something messy but mundane. Tonight, darkness felt sharper than the blade he kept in his ankle holster. The address came through in patches, third house on the left, the dispatcher panting with information overload, another call cutting in about a wreck on I-10. Clark. Parked by the low hedge, punctuated by tired azaleas that once bloomed like fireworks each spring. The porch light was off, though voices drifted through the cracked screen door, a soft, dissonant melody of weeping and gasping rage. He tapped his mic, asked for backup, but got static and chatter about other emergencies. Inside, the air tasted stale like old sweat and something coppery, acrid. The living room was a ruin. A broken chair leg sat upright through the carpet. ATV remote sprayed in what Clark knew instantly was blood. He swallowed, thumb brushing the grip of his service. Pistol. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but he'd sworn to protect. He moved through the foyer, every creak spiking his heart. The walls were papered in peeling pastel stripes, once cheerful, now smeared and stained. A baby mobile hung in the corner, discs of plastic birds swaying without breeze. Then he saw the stairs. The risers were glistening, dripped in a fresh, dark wash that shimmered in the flashlight's beam. He craned his head upward. The blood trailed like a grotesque vine. His radio crackled. "You copy, Clark?" It was Corporal Jensen. He cleared his throat. "I'm going to check upstairs." 2 steps up, and the scent hit him full. Iron and rot. The nursery door hung open as if inviting him. He stepped inside on careful solace. The walls here? They screamed with childish cheer-pale yellow daisies and dancing bunnies, but smothered by something else, stenciled across the wall above. The crib was the outline of an infant face, rounded cheeks, curling eyelashes. But where an eye should be, 3 within each socket. A third one exactly between the other 2. Clark's breath hitched. The wallpaper pattern repeated this face, small and precise. Plastered like a mob of silent witnesses, the crib rocked on its own, a gentle arc, back and forth, back and forth. No child inside, only a crimson blanket twisted at the corner, wet and clotted. He crouched, the floor slick beneath him. He flicked the mobile. The bird spun slowly, ragged. His flashlight beam settled on the walls. The daisies framed those triple-eyed grins. He dropped the beam to the mattress and shivered. To see faint footprints as if tiny shoes had padded there, then washed away by blood. His radio again, Jensen asking for status. Clark didn't answer. He pressed a gloved finger to the nearest wall, felt the cracked plaster give. With a soft scuff, the whole sheet peeled. Beneath, the raw wood was carved deep gouges forming letters, G-E-T-U-T. He froze. The glyphs were old, dried long before the fresh blood. But the new drips ran over them as if to underline the warning. A soft crying rose behind him. Clark turned in a blur. The crib stood empty, rocking faster. The weeping rose to a keening wail, childlike, but warped, echoing off the walls. He swallowed down bile. Some part of him wanted to flee then, but he stayed, flashlight trembling, and swept the room. There in the corner, half hidden by a torn curtain, a rocking chair turned slowly. Then a small shape no more than 3 feet tall stepped into the dim light. It looked like a child, hair matted in blood, eyes. Those 3 eyes stared straight at him. Its mouth opened in a gurgling laugh. Clark's skin crawled. He backed only to feel the floor give way under his boot. A rusted nail scratched his ankle. He staggered, nearly collapsing. The thing tilted its head, unnatural, insectile. It raised a bony hand and pointed at the door. The wail crescendoed so loud his ribs rattled. He lunged out, stumbling into the hallway and sliding down to the bottom stair. The house trembled, as if shivering. He darted for the front door. It slammed shut before he could touch the knob. His flashlight clattered beside him. He grabbed it, yanking it back up, aimed. The beam at the threshold. Dark dens of shadow yawned nothing but the sideboard sprayed with spatters of blood. The wail faded to whispers, then silence, leaving only his ragged breathing. He rammed the door. It gave. He spilled onto the porch, stumbling past the azaleas, now mottled with red spots. Clark's pulse was hammering. Sweat ran in rivulets down his neck. He didn't look back. He leapt into his cruiser, threw it into reverse, fishtailed onto the street. Tires screamed, hubcaps glowed in the roadside lamps. He peeled away, leaving the house to ghosts. Back at the station, he barely spoke. The dispatcher logged a false wall carving and possible break-in, but when Sid checked the address, they found a vacant lot overgrown with weeds, no foundations, no hedges, nothing. No records of a house ever existing. The lot was dry, sun-bleached, punctuated by a single weathered sign, "Lot available." The rubble of the street seemed empty. That address belonged to nothing. By the time he drove past that empty plot, his cruiser lights framed only grass. Clark slammed the door, refusing reruns of the images in his head. He wrote his report. Sergeant Clark responded to a domestic disturbance call at 1423 Pine Terrace. No structure found at location. No victims, no suspects. Further investigation recommended. He signed off, hands trembling. That night, in his apartment, he lay staring at the ceiling, trying to scrub out the 3-eyed faces. He dreamed of little footprints running in circles, the nursery mobile clanging like the death knell of innocence. When the sun rose, he packed a single bag. He left all papers on his desk except one, a torn strip of wallpaper, stuffed in an envelope labeled evidence. By noon, he was at the Greyhound station in Beaumont, ticket in hand for the first bus out of Texas. He never looked back as the city skyline receded behind the dusty windows. The envelope sat on his lap, a heavy weight. He watched the bayous and cypress trees blur past, every mile taking him further from that corridor of horrors. But no matter how far he ran, he could not shake the sense that he carried something more than fear. A warning written in blood and carved in wood. A message meant for anyone who might follow. And somewhere, in the hush beyond his vision, he could still hear that nursery mobile tinkling its lament for a child that never was. He felt the desert pressing in on him before he heard the choir. The heat had broken into a cold that seeped into his bones, the endless expanse of Texas sand suddenly feeling as cramped as a coffin. The sun was low, those long Marfa shadows, stretching like angry fingers across the dunes, and he was on foot because the patrol thought the radio static worth investigating. Corporal Jamal Price had been on plenty of weird calls in his time, but nothing prepared him for hymns and minor. Keys played over the hiss and crackle of an empty channel. At first he thought it was some Civil War reenactor's prank. Then the voices harmonized into something that sounded close to lamentation, sung by a congregation of invisible voices. His stomach did a slow flop. He scanned the horizon, just scrub brush and ghosts of moonlight painted on rocks. He turned up the gain, and for a moment the wind ceased. He could hear each note, mournful and unending. Nobody else in the unit reported a choir. He was alone in this ghost song, and with every passing bar his heart thudded louder as if it would shatter his ribs. His boots sank into the sand as he followed the sound, his sergeant's caution echoing in his head even as every instinct screamed to run. The footprints came without warning, clear as day and ground too dry to hold much detail, prints of boots he didn't recognize. They led him in a tentative line like an invitation. He swallowed back the bile rising in his throat and pressed forward, each step an agreement. The choir rose to a crescendo, voices merging into a single keening wail, then receding into a hollow lullaby before starting again. He reached the circle of crushed brush as the sky burned pink behind him. The plants were shattered, twisted, bent, dead in a perfect ring. He paused at the edge, feeling a force tug at his collar, a quiet insistence. Come in. His radio flared with static and that same faint melody, now throbbing in rhythm with his pulse. He reached into the circle and stood at its center, the scrub crunching underfoot like bones. There was nothing but space, but as he blinked, his surroundings slipped away. The air turned viscous, darker than desert night, a void that sucked sound and light into its depths. He braced himself against invisible pressure at his back, the sky above vanishing into an inky smear. "Corporal Price, do you read?" Came a voice on his headset, familiar, drawn out, panicked. He tried to speak, but only a strangled gasp emerged. The mixtape choir soared one last time, then cut away, plunging him into a vacuum so absolute he could taste it, metallic and slick. The edges of the void shimmered, like heat ripples on asphalt, but reversed cold reaching toward him. He took a step, and the circle of brush slipped behind him, dissolving. He was not where he had been. The desert had folded in on itself, stacking dunes overhead like vaulted ceilings in some subterranean cathedral. The ground beneath him wasn't sand but pulsing flesh, as if the earth were breathing. With a sick crack, he realized the dunes flexed and undulated beneath his boots. His breath hitched. He raised his hand and pressed it to the ground. It gave slightly, warm, sticky. He jerked back, stumbling, and in that moment the choir returned, but softer, closer, echoing from inside his skull. He covered his ears, but the notes tore through bone-dot visions flickered at the edge of his vision. Pale faces with hollow eyes, mouths open in silent hurrahs, fingers twitching. He forced himself to look, and the faces hummed to him. They drifted closer, phantoms made of static and sorrow, congregating in the darkness. They weren't quite solid shadows more than flesh, but Price's gut flared into a furnace of dread as he realized they were staring at him. They pointed crooked fingers, beckoning him deeper into the void. He scrambled forward, desperate to escape, but the dunes shifted around him, endless and repeating. Behind him, the crushed brush reformed into jagged, grasping shapes that pulsed. Like living tissue. He turned, his radio sputtering, "Corporal Price?" Then nothing but static and laughter, low, strange, inhuman laughter that didn't match the choir's elegy. The laughter erupted into a chorus of voices and thinned into whispers. "You belong here." He fumbled for the radio's transmit button, but when he tried to call out, only guttural sounds escaped. Something revolting moved behind his ears, like 100 tiny feet skittering across his brain's surface. His vision blurred, and with slow revulsion, he reached for his head. His fingers came away sticky. He stared at them and saw trailing threads of black ichor. He lifted a hand to his ear, and with a single twitch, the surface of his skin parted like writhing petals. Beneath, pale meat pulsed, and in that raw wound, dozens of spindly, curved things scraped and stretched. He choked, collapsing to his knees. The hymns faded, replaced by his heartbeat thundering in the sudden emptiness. He clawed at the things, ripping handfuls free and flinging them away with frantic disgust. Each one coiled and skittered back, fusing with the wound, multiplying. Desperation spiked, and he tore at his ear with his other hand, disconnecting the radio that had cursed at him. His screams echoed, but swallowed by the void they seemed private, lost in that living desert tomb. When his colleagues reached the spot sun, climbing toward noon, desert calm restored, they found him curled in the center of the circle of brush, shuddering. His uniform was gone. Only tatters remained, caked in dark crust. His head tilted at a grotesque angle, and as they approached, his trembling hand shot out, peeling something from his ear. He stared up at them with tear-filled eyes, and in his palm lay a handful of nails. Not human nails, too long, too twisted curved. Like talons. He held them like trophies and grinned, a slow, feral curl of his lips. Then he began to chew, snapping them between his teeth, crunching bone against bone, humming softly a hymn they could not hear. Lieutenant Sarah Torres felt the piney woods press in on her from every side as she followed the twin beams of headlights slicing through the thick, humid night air. The crickets and frogs that usually filled the forest with their chorus had fallen silent, as if listening for something worse than her cruiser's rumbling V8. Sweat trickled down her neck, sticking her uniform collar to her skin, and she could taste the faint tang of diesel mixed with damp pine needles. Every rustle of leaves, every distant owl call, made her grip tighten on the wheel. The radio crackled with static, no dispatch, no backup, and the road ahead twisted deeper into the forest, branches clawing at her windshield. When the road ended, she slammed on the brakes, the tires shrieking against gravel, and saw it. Her own car, headlights ablaze, parked crooked. Across the narrow logging trail, the engine screamed and idled without a driver, its brake lights pulsing like the heart of some wounded animal. Sarah's pulse hammered in her temples as she swung her door open. Cold air rushed out, smelling of wet bark and something else, something coppery. She reached for her sidearm but left it holstered, drawn instead to a need to see. As she approached, each footstep crunched over debris, snapping twigs like bones underfoot. The door creaked open on its own, a slow hinge scream echoing through the trees. Sarah froze, half afraid to look inside, half afraid of what she'd see if she didn't. Darkness filled the car's interior, but beneath the dash lights, she saw movement, a shape, hunched and black, shifting just beyond sight. Fear, cold and taut, gripped her spine as she stepped closer. The shape lunged, a black smear of impossibility, and Sarah felt it before she saw it, a clammy weight slamming into her chest, breath reeking of rot and earth. The world spun. The headlights behind her cut through her vision like twin knives. She grabbed at the thing's arm, a human arm? No, too long, too thin, the skin mottled and slick, the fingers unnaturally jointed. Its grip tightened, pulling her forward, dragging her into the car as the doors slammed shut behind her with a finality that echoed in Sarah's ears. The engine revved to life, and the car lurched forward, rolling down the road without a driver at the wheel. Sarah's hand slapped the passenger seat, then the dash, trying to find some purchase, some way to stop this machine from carrying her deeper into the woods. She saw the speedometer climb, 20-30, approaching 50 miles an hour faster. Then the car should go on this rutted logging road. Trees blurred past the windows, black trunks flashing white in the headlight beams. She tried the door handle locked. Panic rose, hot and suffocating, but beneath it lay something darker. Recognition. She'd seen eyes like this, pupils too dark to reflect light. In old case files, victims who returned from the woods, mumbling of shadows that watched, of something waiting. She stifled a scream as the creature loomed over her, its face buried in shadow, but she could see its lips part, revealing teeth like shards of black glass. And then it spoke, its voice a rasp that seemed to come from the car's grill as much as its throat. "Lieutenant." "Hello." Sarah's vision swam. She pressed her forehead to the cold glass, trying to picture herself behind the wheel, trying to will the car to stop for her. The forest around them seemed to pulse, alive in the headlights, as if the trees themselves were leaning in to watch. The thing reached out, its fingers brushing her cheek, leaving a trail of damp decay. Memories crashed through her mind. The missing boy last summer, found in a clearing with his eyes gouged out. The family whose screams had echoed off these same pines, their cabin burned to ashes. The old journal she'd found at the station, written by loggers who spoke of the man in the dark and warned never to follow lights into the woods. Sarah's heart hammered, and somewhere deep inside, beyond terror, a spark of defiance took hold. She twisted, slamming her boot against the door's interior latch with all her strength. Metal groaned, and the latch shuddered, but the thing let out a low chuckle, like wind whistling through dead wood. Logs snapped, branches cracked as they barreled forward. At the last possible moment, the door popped open, and Sarah's body was thrown into the swaying forest, skidding over damp earth to a halt against a moss-covered stump. Pain exploded in her shoulder, but adrenaline kept her from noticing. She rolled over onto her hands and knees, gasping, watching as her car vanished down the road, its headlights swallowed by the night. The thing inside must have retaken control. Her place. Sarah pushed to her feet, adrenaline and terror warring inside her. She reached for her radio, found a dead no signal. She looked up the logging road, saw only darkness framed by pines, as if the forest itself were waiting. The air carried a faint hum, like the low thrum of an engine, and Sarah realized it was her breathing. She took a shaky step forward, then another, moving toward where her car had disappeared. Each footstep sank into the loam, each breath tasted of pine resin and fear. She pledged to herself she'd find that car, she'd shut off that engine, put an end to whatever shadow had seized it and whoever now sat in her seat. As she disappeared into the blackened corridor of trees, the forest seemed to exhale, branches brushing together in a soft, sinister applause. And somewhere, just ahead, The headlights pulsed again, calling her deeper. "Lieutenant, follow me." The wind off the Gulf rattled the rusting letters above Caldwell and Son's funeral home like a dying animal's last breath as Sheriff Mark. Caldwell pulled his cruiser to a juddering stop beneath the flickering porch light. His heart pounded in. His chest, half from the late hour and half from a dread that had nothing to do with the midnight alarm. An alarm that had cut through the humid Galveston air like an accusation. He climbed the cracked concrete steps, the bright beam of his flashlight cutting through the gloom, and paused at the entrance. The door was unlocked, swinging just wide enough to show him that the lobby beyond was empty, but for long rows of mahogany coffins, their lids gleaming under the overhead bulbs. He stepped inside, boots echoing hollowly against the tile, and felt a tightening in his chest. His gun hand trembled. Every alarmed funeral home scene he'd ever heard about on the police scanner ended with a robber running off with jewelry or copper piping. But this place smelled of something much older, something dead and patient. He swept his light across. The first row. Each coffin sat closed, chrome handles polished to a mirror sheen. On the far wall, a shallow door marked family entrance stood ajar, blackness yawning within like a cavern. Something in that darkness called to him, but he steadied himself and moved on. He'd been a lawman for 25 years. Whatever was out there, he could handle it. He reached the viewing room next, where 7 mahogany lids lay closed, each one locking shut with a quiet click as he passed until he arrived at the 8th. His breath caught. The lid was open, empty. His flashlight's beam shook as he raised it to the others beyond. Every single one was flung back, like someone or something had ripped them open. Coffin after coffin yawned at him, hollow as graves dug by cold machinery. Caldwell swallowed. He should have called for backup. His radio lay forgotten on the counter behind him, dead batteries making it nothing more than a useless chunk of plastic. His daughter's music box, her favorite, wind-up ballerina in a pink tutu set, balanced on the lip of the open coffin nearest him. The soft chime of its melody spun itself over and over in the silent room, innocent and mocking. Tink, tink, whirl. Tink, tink, whirl, as though a child still played with it. Caldwell's throat burned with unshed tears. He recognized that tune first the day Emily was born, a gift from her grandmother, and he hadn't heard it in years, not since she died. "My girl," he whispered, voice strangled. His boots kicked dust off the floor as he approached the music box, each note echoing through his skull like a memory he couldn't escape. He reached out a trembling hand, half expecting the ballerina's arms to move, to spin toward him in that cursed dance, but the wind-up key lay still. He glanced at the empty coffin beneath it. This was the one marked for her. Mark Caldwell's Emily, 5 years old, bright eyes, sunflower giggle. He'd signed the paperwork himself. But now the lid was open and the space inside yawning, and the music box sat atop it like an invitation. A sudden knock clacked through the room, the coffin lid slamming shut with bone-shaking force. Caldwell jerked back, breath leaving his lungs. The music stopped. Silence crashed around him. Then a rustle, like a dress brushing across the floor, came from the coffin. A soft giggle bubbled up, distant and nowhere at once, like a memory echoing. Off stone walls. "Daddy," it said. He stumbled back, every instinct screaming to flee, but he couldn't turn away. He squinted into the darkness beyond the open door of the family entrance, vision blurring as his pulse hammered in his ears. "This isn't real," he told himself. "It's just a sick joke." But the air turned heavy with sorrow, thick as seaweed, and he felt a sob rise in his throat. He knelt beside the coffin, hand shaking as he reached for the music box again. The moment his skin touched the cool metal, a wind slammed through the building, rattling windows and plunging every bulb into hissing darkness. Caldwell cursed and raised his flashlight, but its beam was suddenly weak, as though fighting some unseen current. Then the laughter came. Soft at first, a child's happy trill, floating through the black. "Daddy, play with me," it coaxed. He froze. Impossible. Emily was gone. He eased forward, chest tight, and the beam of his light found her just inside the coffin, pale legs folded neatly. Her dress faded but clean, auburn curls spilling across her shoulders. She looked smaller than he remembered, like a picture caught between two frames, smiling up at him with eyes too knowing, too old. He blinked, and she was gone. The beam jerked away, and he heard the lid slam again, echoing through the funeral home like a guillotine. He stumbled backward, head spinning, mind fracturing with grief and fear. He raced toward the family entrance, determined to get out, but the door slammed in his face. The latch clicked home as though someone on the other side had locked it. Caldwell pounded the door with both fists, heart hammering. "Emily!" he roared. "Emily, come back!" No answer, only distant echo of that music. He turned, back. Against the door, sweeping the flashlight through the gloom. The coffins all down the row were closed once more, silent sentinels. The music box sat in the center of the room where he'd left it, but now its key turned itself, the ballerina lifting into motion once, then stopping. He took a step toward it and felt a cold brush on his arm-like fingers slipping beneath his sleeve. He jerked away, shining the light, but nothing was there. Then the music box began again, tink tink whirl, tink tink whirl, and the small ballerina spun wildly, arms flung wide as though in celebration. Caldwell sank to his knees, gaze locked on the spinning toy, tears streaking through the dust and ash on his cheeks. He whispered, "I'm sorry," voice thick. Beyond the wavering beam of his light, the other coffins began to open, one by one, crawling open on their own hinges. And from each, a face children, old men, strangers he'd never met peered out with lifeless eyes. They smiled as they rose, phantom bodies that shouldn't exist, stepping out onto the floor, surrounding him in a ring of the dead. The music box stuttered to a halt, silence pressing in so hard his ears rang. Then Emily's laugh, crystal and cruel, echoed off the ceiling. "Daddy," she said, at his shoulder. He turned, gasping, and there she stood in the beam of his flashlight, small hand reaching for his. His heart cracked. He knelt, arms outstretched, but before he could touch her, the ghostly gathering pressed in, faces twisted in joy, hungry for a living soul. Caldwell shouted her name and lunged, but the floor yawned beneath him, and he fell backward into the opening of a coffin, the lid slamming over his shoulders. The last thing he saw was Emily's face smiling down at him from the other side of the wood. Then darkness and the faint whisper of a lullaby as the coffin was buried from within. The sun hovered low over the desert horizon as Deputy Elena Ruiz rolled into Dry Creek on wheels that rattled like bones. She'd driven this stretch of blacktop countless times, until last week when the tip came, a lone gas station standing. Half buried in dust, its sign swinging on one rusted hinge and blinking its offers of ice, soda, cigarettes, except the neon tubes were dead and the sweet black letters faded away. Now the radio crackled with static and the tumbleweeds whispered around her cruiser as she cut the engine and climbed out, boots crunching against sand and cracked asphalt. The station's windows were smeared with grime so thick it looked like coagulated blood, and the single pump sat crooked, its hose lying limp like a soaked rope. Elena's throat tightened when she noticed the wet patch staining, the concrete under its nozzle fresh and still glistening. She stepped closer, badge tucked under her shoulder, flashlight raised. The pump's digital display flickered in and out, numbers blinking erratically, but she caught 0.0 and then Impatient, she pressed her fingers to the trigger and then froze as a thick, dark liquid hissed and dripped, splattering at her boots. Her pulse hammered in her ears when she realized it wasn't gasoline. It was blood-warm, copper-sweet, pooling at the crack between floor and pump. She jerked her hand back, hard slamming, and the trickle slowed to a faint drip. "Everything okay, deputy?" came a dry voice behind her. She turned, and there he was, the station owner, except he shouldn't have been. His face was sallow, cheeks sunken, eyes empty sockets that gleamed with something hungry. His threadbare shirt hung from his ribs, like mourning drapes, and in one hand he held a lantern. No, not a lantern, but his own severed head. Scalp peeled back to expose the bone beneath, hair matted and dry. The head's mouth was stretched in a grin as wide and endless as the prairie itself, and its eyes rolled in their sockets, reflecting her flashlight in tiny, mocking glints. Elena's breath caught. Everything inside her screamed to run, to fire. Her service weapon, to radio for backup, but her feet stayed rooted as if she'd been nailed to the ground. The head in his hand swung gently, light bouncing off the jagged stump at its base, and the figure's grin grew broader the longer she stared. "You shouldn't be here," he said, voice rough as gravel, and tilted his head still attached to his shoulders toward the pump. Not until the old well sated. She blinked, and the pump began to pulse, spurting another gush of blood that hissed against the concrete and sent puddles racing toward her boots. Sirens echoed in her skull, the taste of copper filling her mouth, but she forced herself to speak. "What happened here? Where's the real station owner?" He chuckled, a sound like dry leaves scraping a gravestone. "He's thirsty," the man answered. "We all get thirsty." The severed head in his lantern hand turned to face her, lips forming silent words. She could almost hear her daughter's laughter in that vacant grin, the tiny, cruel echo of something once alive. Adrenaline surged. She leveled her flashlight at his chest. "Show yourself," she ordered, voice steadier than she felt. The man's grin faltered, and in that instant Elena saw the face of the deputy before her, not the station owner, but a twisted reflection of herself, wide eyes, trembling jaw, and uniform stained with red. She staggered back, one hand lifting to cover her mouth as the desert wind roared in her ears. When she dared to peer again, the figure had vanished, fading like a hallucination at sunrise. The blood continued to pool around the pump, thick blackening rings spreading outward, and the severed head sat atop the nozzle like a grotesque trophy. Its grin fixed an eternal welcome. Elena's radio crackled to life, a static-laced voice calling her name, but there was no reply, only the pulse of her own heartbeat pounding in her temples. She spun toward the cruiser and bolted, the world, tilting beneath her boots as the station owner's laughter chased her across the pavement. Behind her, the blood climbed up the pump's hose, seeping into the handle until it looked like a sinuous muscle, alive and pulsing. She threw herself into the cruiser and slammed the door, yanking the keys from her pocket. The engine roared, tires screeching as she tore away from the station, but in the rearview mirror the lantern-head figure stood at the door. Watching her leave, its head lifted in a silent benediction, even as the desert swallowed Dry Creek behind her. The taste of blood lingered on her tongue, and her breath came ragged, each gasp a reminder that some thirst could not be slaked with gasoline. In her mirror, the road stretched empty and endless, and she knew, with a cold certainty, that wherever she went, the ghost of that station pump would follow, dispensing blood instead of fuel, until she ran until the sun burned out or her heart gave way beneath the weight of that final, impossible grin. Grace Nguyen eased her patrol car onto the shoulder of Route 90, the desert night stretching out flat and impossible in every direction. The dash lights painted her face in a sickly green glow, and she could taste the grit of West Texas wind. on her tongue. She'd been on this road for hours, chasing a speeder in a battered Chevy pickup that refused to pull over. The engine note had been smooth, almost too smooth, like someone had rebuilt it in a whispered prayer. She flipped her spotlight on again, catching sight of the truck's taillights flickering ahead, bobbing like tired eyes in the mirror. Something about the driver's posture made her chest tighten. The way he leaned against the open window, arm resting on the door, waiting. It was so casual it felt like a trap. She called dispatch, voice calm but low. Unit 379er, suspect still heading westbound, misdemeanor reckless endangerment, requesting backup. The radio crackled, a brittle hiss that reminded her of static drowning out a voice she'd never known. She scanned her mirror one more time and saw the truck's brake lights flare. He was stopping. Grace pressed her lips thin, heart tapping a warning. She clicked her mic again. "I'm going to make contact." Gripping her flashlight in one hand and her service pistol in the other, she climbed out into the desert chill. The wind was sharp, cutting at her uniform like a blade. She moved toward the driver's side, boots crunching over broken rock and scrawled messages etched into the sandy shoulder. She read the words long after she'd passed them. "No one here leave now," written in charcoal or maybe dried blood. She shook off the thought. Dolls of tumbleweed piled at the wheels of the truck, shifting like skittering creatures desperate to escape. "Officer Nguyen," she said, pushing the flashlight beam through the tinted window. The light fell on the driver's face and Grace froze. That face was hers, every feature identical down to the fine scar above her left eyebrow, a souvenir from a training accident she'd barely survived. The eyes were darker, hollowed as if they'd been sunburned by some unseen fire. The grin was slow, predatory, teeth flashing in the beam like fangs. He raised a hand, palm out, and mimicked her usual greeting. "Evening," he said, voice a rasped echo of her own. Her breath caught. She tried to steady herself. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," she ordered, tone firm. Her heart pounded so hard she felt it in her throat. But where she expected her reflection to comply, her doppelganger only tilted her head, amusement curling at the corners of that cruel smile. She closed the door with a thud that reverberated in Grace's chest. Then the truck door swung open and the other Grace stepped out, moving with an uncanny grace that no human body should possess. The headlights registered her pale silhouette against the star-studded sky. Grace's own legs trembled, adrenaline flooding through her. She kept the flashlight trained on the figure, who produced a badger badge from the pocket of a denim jacket. She flicked it open, letting the light catch the emblem. It was real. It was perfect. "You don't belong here," Grace whispered, though she wondered if her voice would carry. The imposter laughed, a wet, hollow sound that seemed to suck moisture from the air. She flicked the badge shut and slid it back into her pocket. "Don't I?" she asked, stepping closer. Her feet barely touched the ground, silent on the gravel. Grace pivoted, trying to maintain space. She backed up over the charcoal warning scrawled on the pavement. The words read now, "He comes for you." A hatch of panic clicked open in Grace's chest. She clicked her mic again, but no sound emerged. The radio on her shoulder was dead. She fumbled for it, heart stuttering, pressing the talk button until her hand shook. Nothing. The desert swallowed. Her, please. She turned back to face her mirror image and found the imposter gone. Her flashlight beam swept the empty stretch of road. No truck. No driver. Just Grace alone, bathed in the harsh wash of her own light. The door of her patrol car was open. The interior light still spilled out like an invitation. She stepped inside, slammed the door, and locked it, then hit the siren switch. A keening wail cut through the night as if to summon everything nearby. The radio crackled back to life under the red and blue flash, dispatch voices rushing in. She told them the scene was clear. No vehicle in sight, no suspect to be found. She gave them the mileage marker, the coordinates she'd mentally bookmarked. The dispatcher told her backup was on the way, but Grace didn't wait. She floored the accelerator, leaving skid marks and the weight of unsaid warnings behind. The siren faded as she moved, the desert swallowing her cry again. Miles later, the headlights of a backup unit flashed in her rearview mirror. She pulled over, breathing in hiccups. The other officer, young and nervous, approached her window. Grace lowered it, her face streaked with sweat and dust. He peered in. "You okay, Officer Nguyen? We got your call about a driver matching your description?" His voice wavered. She nodded slowly. "He was right here," she said, voice flat, distant. He smiled at me. The young officer frowned and shook his head. "No one here but you and me." Grace closed her eyes, pressing her palms to her temples. She could still feel the weight of those hollow eyes on her skin, and the echo of that sick grin. She opened her eyes and stared at her own reflection in the side mirror, smooth, human, real, and shivered as she saw, far off, something flicker at the tree line. A silhouette stepping out of the darkness, hands raised in her familiar motion. Grace blinked, and it was gone. She stood beside her patrol car, siren still wailing, and whispered into the night, "He's always coming." The words drifted upward, unanswered, carried off by the wind across the flat, endless expanse of desert across Route 90 into the dark heart of Texas. Detective Roy Martinez had never felt the road whisper before, the low, mournful hum of tires on asphalt, the way the horizon sagged under a slate-gray sky that threatened rain. He sat in his cruiser at the edge of the interstate, hands tight. On the wheel, waiting for the coroner's team to arrive. The yellow tape flapped in the hot July breeze, carrying the sickly sweet scent of gasoline mingled with something fouler, something like old sweat and rot. He glanced at the body slumped in the driver's seat of the battered sedan. The victim's face was pressed against the steering wheel, and Roy's breath caught. The jawline, the cheekbones, the shape of the hairline, everything about that corpse was achingly familiar. A decade ago, his partner, Detective Lucas Graves, had died in a similar road rage incident. Roy had been the one to find him, shattered glass crunching under his boots, blood painting the pavement in dark rivulets, the ghost of a scream still etched in his mind. The department had mourned him. The newspapers had splashed his name in bold, righteous type. Dedicated officer slain in line of duty. Even the mayor had attended the funeral. Every detail had been coldly catalogued. The angle of the bullet, the make of the weapon, the profile of the suspect who'd vanished. Into the night a month later. But the thing about memory is that it doesn't stay dead. It coils around your heart and squeezes, making you see things that shouldn't be there. Roy tapped the side of his head, trying to shake the dizziness, and as he did, the body stirred. One arm twitched, the hand brushing against the window frame, the fingers too long, too slender, curled like claws. A soft, wet sound like someone licking their lips echoed in the silent car. Roy's pulse kicked up, hammering in his ears. He backed away, training his flashlight through the shattered window. The face lifted. It turned toward him, and Roy froze. The skin was pale, ashen, and slick with something that caught the light, slimy, glistening droplets bead by bead along the cheek. The eyes were empty sockets at first, dark hollows, but then they flickered with something alive. They snapped open, and Roy saw Lucas. Not the Lucas from 10 years ago, with the clean-shaven face and the bright, mocking grin. This Lucas was gone, the skin stretched tight over bone, and the flesh around the eyes stained black. Fresh wounds laced his torso, entrails poking through jagged openings, and thick, foul ichor dripped from each wound. Roy felt bile rise in his throat. His hand drifted to the service pistol at his hip, but the world tilted as a distant thunder rolled across the sky. He dropped to one knee, pressing his free hand against the hot asphalt. The tape fluttered frantically as wind whipped through the scene. He could hear the coroner's engine pulling in, but it felt like miles away. Lucas's head jolted, vertebrae cracking in a horrifying melody, and he pushed himself upright, the seatbelt snapping as if it were a rubber band. The interior light flickered on and off, casting the dashboard in strobing shadows. Lucas's mouth opened, and a rasping voice hissed, "Roy ... Roy's voice caught in his throat. He forced it out, barely more than a croak. "Lucas?" The eyes focused, and for a moment, Roy saw the desperation in them, the same haunted look he'd seen when Lucas stumbled into the precinct gasping for help, blood pooling at his feet, 10 years ago to the day. Except that time, Lucas had been alive and Roy had been too late. Now Lucas's lips drew back into a grin, one that stretched too wide, too eager, as if his skull had been cracked open to make room for it. "I waited for you," he said, voice wet as dripping blood. Lightning cracked overhead, and the world fell into harsh, white light. Roy scrambled backward, his flashlight clattering to the ground. The beam spun wildly, illuminating the victims. Seat, the torn metal of the door, the slick trail of ichor that led onto the pavement. Roy's knees hit the ground, and he pressed both hands over his ears as if sound itself were an assault. A high-pitched keening cut through the air and agonized. Cry, half human, half mechanical, a song of rusted gears grinding against bone. Roy's heart thundered, and he willed himself to stand, to draw his weapon, to do something. Anything. With hands shaking, he grabbed his pistol and kicked out the door, sending it swinging across the tarmac. Lucas stepped out of the car, limbs jerking in grotesque imitation of life. Each wound in his chest oozed fetid ichor that sizzled where it hit the asphalt. His boots were caked with mud and blood and something darker on them. Roy thought he saw tiny bones, as if Lucas had walked through some fallen cemetery. Roy raised his gun. "Lucas, I don't know what this is," he rasped, voice raw. "But, I swear, I wish you peace." Lucas tilted his head, the heavy metal of his badge clinking against his ribcage. "Peace," he whispered, stepping forward. "You had your chance." Roy fired. The bullet cracked through the humid night, and Lucas went down, but not the way a body falls. He slumped to his knees, then bit the air, teeth scraping, as if he exhaled agony itself. The wound in his shoulder opened wider, and instead of blood, a thick black sludge pulsed out, hitting Roy in the chest. He coughed, the sludge sliding into his mouth, sticky and cold. He spat it out, blinking against nausea. Lucas tried to rise, convulsing, flesh knitting back together as if sewn by invisible hands. Roy fired again and again, each shot echoing down the highway until the magazine clicked empty. Lucas rolled to one side, and the sludge pooled at his feet, bubbling as if boiling. Roy dropped the empty weapon, hands trembling, and steadying himself against the hood of his cruiser. He squeezed his eyes shut. In the deep dark behind his lids, he saw Lucas as he'd been, alive, smiling, the day they'd shared coffee and derided a bad donut. He saw Lucas fall, saw the red bloom on his shirt, heard his scream. He felt the cold of death closing in around him. He took a rag from his pocket, dusty, sweat-stained, and pressed it to his chest, breathing hard. When he dared open his eyes, Lucas, or whatever had claimed his body, was gone. No pool of sludge, no battered sedan. The night was still. The only sound was the hum of the interstate, the whisper of tires, and somewhere distant, the first. Raindrops pattering against the asphalt. Roy sank to the ground, ragged breaths rolling through him. The coroner's van lights bobbed closer, red and blue flickering in the gloom. They'd think this was a homicide, Another sick prank, a dead man behind the wheel. They wouldn't understand. He looked at the spot where Lucas had knelt and saw the faint imprint of a boot pressed into the tar like a message. Roy bent down, fingers brushing the cool surface. There, scrawled in dark ichor, the single word, remember. He let the rain wash the letters away as he sat back, shaking, the memory alive and screaming inside him, demanding that he never forget. Officer Naomi Blake eased her cruiser through the narrow road that wound around the lake's edge, its headlights slicing through the early evening mist that rose like ghostly fingers from the water's surface. The radio crackled once, then fell silent, as though reluctant to disturb the hush that settled over the RV park. She remembered arriving last summer, the laughter drifting from campsites, the smell of barbecue mingling with pine. Tonight, the fire pits were cold, the trailers standing like silent sentinels under a sky smeared with bruised clouds. Naomi's boots crunched on gravel as she walked between rows of empty chairs and overturned coolers. Dinner plates, half-eaten, set on fold-out tables, forks lying abandoned in purses of ketchup and gravy. A mug, still warm, gave off a faint wisp of steam. Someone had been here minutes ago, yet there wasn't a soul in sight. She squinted toward the tree line, where footprints pressed deep into the damp earth, small clusters of prints and sneakers. Bare toes, even a few smaller that might have belonged to a child. They vanished into the shadow of pine and oak, disappearing as though swallowed by the forest itself. Naomi's heart thudded against her ribs, a steady drumbeat of dread. She unshouldered her flashlight and clicked it on. The beam trembled in her hand, illuminating twisted vines and rotting logs, the smell of moss and damp earth so thick she could taste it. She followed the prints, each step echoing too loudly in the stillness. The forest floor gave way to a narrow path that wound upward, as though guiding her to some secret place. She paused when the trees grew impossibly dense, their branches laced overhead, forming a cathedral of wood that blocked the sky. The beam danced across something half-hidden. Behind a wall of ivy, a steeple, its spire bowed, covered in thick green moss that dripped in damp clumps. As she pushed aside the vines, a rusted bell hung suspended over a yawning doorway, its clapper swaying like a pendulum. Naomi swallowed. The church was small, squat, like one a prospector might have built in the 19th century, but decay had claimed it decades ago. She pressed her palm to the wooden door, which groaned as it opened into pitch darkness. She stepped inside, and the flashlight caught the abandoned pews, their wood splintered and rotted, kneelers hanging like detritus. The floor was scattered with trampled hymnals, pages fluttering in a dank breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. Her breath caught as she realized the air smelled of damp linen and something more pungent, rotten fruit or old blood. She raised her light toward the altar, where a crucifix leaned at a crooked angle. Beneath it, the congregation sat in frozen rows. Naomi's stomach lurched. The figures were human in shape, but their heads were tilted downward, faces hidden beneath hoods of ragged cloth, as though they had been arranged for a long-forgotten ritual. She stepped closer, her heel clicking on stone. In the beam's glow, she saw that the hoods were pulled back. Empty sockets stared back at her, pits drilled where eyes had once flickered with life. Their jaws hung slack, tongues drawn back as though they had screamed until the breath left their bodies. Naomi's pulse pounded in her ears. She gagged. At the stench of decay that rose from the pews, one of the figures wore a child's denim jacket, the arms too short, sleeves frayed at the cuffs. Another bore the colors of a high school football team, the letterman's jacket hanging loose on a skeletal frame. Naomi's legs trembled. She reflexively reached for her service weapon as the beam drifted over the kneeling benches and settled. On the floor, where more footprints pressed into the earth. They led toward a slit between the altar's base and the wall, a crawl space half hidden by rubble. Naomi crouched, the beam trembling in her hand. She heard something a whisper, so faint it could have been the wind through broken glass. She leaned closer and froze. The words came again, a guttural rasp. "Help me." Naomi's heart seized. She dropped the flashlight, and its beam rolled toward the congregation, illuminating their broken forms in stark, horrifying relief. The whisper became a chorus, swelling into a chant that reverberated through the church. "Help me. Help me." Naomi staggered back, snatched up her radio. "Dispatch," she said, voice shaking. "I need backup at Ravens Hollow RV Park. Possible hostage or missing persons. I'm in the old chapel." The radio crackled static. Silence. She dropped to one knee, her shotgun clenched against her chest. Above her, the chant rose to a deafening crescendo as the pews shuddered, the figures shifting as though poised to rise. Naomi's breath came in ragged gasps. The only clear sound was her own heartbeat, hammering against the walls of her chest. She swung the flashlight toward the crawl space and saw movement, a boot, then a knee, sliding through the gap. A hand emerged, pale and gaunt, fingers curling as though seeking purchase on the stone floor. Naomi snapped back, firing around into the darkness. The hallway erupted in a crack, and the chant died as though strangled. She sprang to her feet, flashlight beam racing to a young girl crawling backward, eyes wide with terror and salt streaks. On her cheeks, "Naomi," the girl whispered. "They made me come." The girl's voice cracked. Naomi felt bile rise in her throat as she knelt beside her, rifle butt still raised. In the dim half-light, the girl's eyes glistened, pupils too large, blackness consuming their depths. The candlelit faces of the congregation turned toward them, mouths opening in silent screams. Naomi reflexively reached for the girl, who recoiled, teeth bared in a snarl that belonged to something wild. "No," the girl hissed, voice warped by fear and something else. "Please, don't. Join them." Naomi's mind spun. She grabbed the girl's arm, yanking her free. The congregation lurched forward, wooden pews groaning, as though moving of their own accord. Naomi stumbled back, dragging the girl through the aisle, each step a struggle against unseen hands that clawed at her coat. She burst through the doorway, stumbling into the cold night air. The church door slammed shut behind her, reverberating through the clearing. Naomi turned, gun trained on the steeple's dark silhouette as the forest seemed to swallow the church whole, vines sliding back into place over the bell tower, footprints erased as though nothing had happened. The girl clung to Naomi, sobbing. Naomi kept her weapon raised, scanning the tree line, waiting for the congregation to follow. But the fog lay still, and the forest was silent once more. She radioed again, voice hoarse. "Dispatch, get units here now. I have one survivor. And I think the others." She trailed off, realizing she couldn't finish the sentence. In the distance, the lake's surface caught the moonlight, calm and indifferent. The RV park sat empty, as though it had never been alive. And beyond it, the forest beckoned, holding its terrible secret beneath layers of moss and shadow. Naomi. Blake backed away, dragging the girl toward her cruiser, knowing she would never speak of what she had seen. Some horrors were meant to remain in silence, buried deep in the woods, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to follow those footprints. Into a moss-covered church where the congregation gaped with empty sockets and whispered for help that would never come. The highway hummed beneath Victor Alvarez's boots long before he saw the rest area, sign flicker under the yellow glow of the late-night lamps. He'd been on the road for almost 12 hours, chasing down a stolen load of machinery that had put him 40 miles outside of Laredo. His shoulders ached, his skull pulsed like a maddening drumbeat, and every billboard stared back at him like accusing eyes. He gunned the engine of his black Tahoe into the gravel lot and killed the headlights, the silence pressing in like damp cloth. He stood for a moment in the open air, staring at the single concrete building rising out of the scrub, wondering if he should sleep in the car instead. The taillights cast a dull red smudge across the cracked asphalt, and a lone tumbleweed skittered by, clacking against the curb. Something about the place made his heart hit his ribs too hard. Maybe it was the way the wind whispered through the chain-link fence, or the stagnant smell of pine trees mixed with something fouler. He shrugged and headed for the door, badge heavy in his jacket pocket, flashlight in one hand. Inside, the fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead, sputtering in and out. The air was stale, thick with the smell of industrial cleaner and old fear. The stalls were lined up in a row, each steel door sagging on its hinges. He spun around to see the message scrawled on everyone. "Don't look up." The letters were uneven and shaky, as if carved one by a hand that shook with terror. He frowned, letting his gaze drift upward. As the warning insisted, the ceiling was nothing remarkable at first. Metal vents set into dingy white panels, the kind you saw in every gas station bathroom across the state. But when his eyes settled on the nearest vent, the light wheezed and flared, and he froze. Against the wire grill, dozens of pale faces pressed their skin until the cheeks flattened and the lips peeled back, forming silent screams. Their eyes were wide with something unnameable hunger, madness, accusation, and their skin looked wet like rotting fish. Victor's mouth went dry. He wanted to step back, to breathe, to call for backup and admit he must be hallucinating. A soft click behind him made him whirl. In the mirror, his own reflection stared, white and drawn. He touched his face. The skin was warm, but his pulse pounded in his throat. He turned back to the vent, and a low, rasping sigh echoed through the pipes like wind through bones. He considered ripping the grate off, shining his beam inside, but a voice from above made him lower his flashlight. "Sergeant Alvarez." The voice was a rasp, familiar as the dry rustling of tumbleweed. It was his own voice, but slowed, warped. Through some deep distortion, his heart kicked up. He looked at the mirror again. His reflection grinned lips wide enough to show perfect white teeth, but the eyes were hollow black pits. The reflection's head jerked, tilting, the grin widening, and it mouthed two words. "Don't look." Victor spun toward the vent grid. The faces were gone. Emptiness stared back, just the dark tunnel of ductwork. He shook his head, disbelief fighting with his gut instincts. Something cold crawled along his spine as he licked his lips. Footsteps, soft, shuffling. He glanced toward the corridor beyond the stalls, where the door to the men's room lay open. The ceiling lights flickered in that direction, and he thought he saw something crouched there, half in shadow. He raised his flashlight, finger on the trigger guard of his pistol, and stepped forward. His boots squeaked on the wet tile. The stench grew stronger, decay mingled with bleach. He swallowed, trying to steady himself. He cleared his throat. "Come on out," he called. His voice sounded brittle. No answer, just the humming of the old bulbs. He edged around the stall doors, sweeping the beam back and forth. 1, 2, 3 empty stalls. On the far wall, a torn poster flapped in a breeze he couldn't feel. He took a deep breath and moved toward the exit. Before he could reach it, a retching sound came from overhead, like someone forcing bile up through a throat that refused to let it out. He froze, focusing upward. Through the gap between the panels, he saw a hand white and gangly curl around the edge. The fingers bent at cruel angles. The hand pulled slowly, then another emerged. A head, sleek hair plastered to its scalp. Lips peeled back, gums raw. The eyes met his, frosted over with black film, just like their owners had been in the mirror. Victor felt sick. He backed away, but the hand twisted, anchoring itself in the grate. A face pushed through, then two. More. They spilled out like ants from a mound, uncurling onto the ceiling panels, skin sliding over metal until the first skull cracked through. The rest area lights flickered violently and went out. Darkness swallowed him. He fumbled for his phone, turned on the flashlight app, and shone it upward. The faces floated just above the metal tiles, dripping wet in the beam's narrow cone. Their mouths stretched impossibly wide, but no sound came. Then the lights snapped back on, brighter than before, bleaching the room. The creatures tumbled down, landing on the floor with slap and groan. Their bodies were gaunt, rib cages jutting beneath translucent skin. They looked half-formed, as if someone had sketched human shapes in chalk and tried to step inside. They advanced. Victor raised his service weapon on instinct and fired. The first shot cracked through a skull, sending bone fragments across the tile. He fired again, but the second creature absorbed the bullet in its chest. The skin bulged but didn't split, the bullet falling onto the floor with a dull clink. The third reached up and caught his arm, pulling him forward. Its grip was like ice, burning at the same time. He yanked his arm free, nauseated by the sensation, and fired at its head. The creature vanished into a puff of sour wind. He turned and bolted for the door, sliding his gun back into its holster. The door handle was ice cold. He flung the door open into the night air, stumbling into the faint glow of the parking lot. His boots hit the gravel. He ran, chest burning, arms pumping, past the gas pumps and the empty picnic tables. The distant highway was a ribbon of light, cars glowing like fireflies. He dove behind his Tahoe, panting, sweat chilling on his skin. He fumbled for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Sergeant Alvarez. I need assistance at the East Rest area on Interstate 35. Send everyone you have. I've encountered something. I need backup now." His voice trembled so much he almost didn't press the button. Static. Crackled, then the calm voice of dispatch came through. "Copy that, Sergeant. Assistance en route. You there?" He looked back once, expecting to see a creature silhouetted by the taillights, but the lot was empty. He crawled into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and sat with his head against the steering wheel, gasping for air. The radio crackled again, voice low with concern. "Stay with me, Alvarez. Help is on the way." He pressed his palm to the glass window, his breath fogging the pain. A single tumbleweed arced across the lot, carried by a breeze that whispered through the fence like a voice, "Don't look up." He dared a glance at the rearview mirror. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw pale eyes behind his own reflection. Then it was gone, and only the empty highway stared back. The night wind that whispered through the mesquite trees carried a hollow promise of solitude as Corporal Rebecca Singh eased her patrol cruiser onto the gravel drive of the old Martinez place. The call had come in as a routine welfare check. A concerned neighbor heard a strange moaning through the walls, the kind you'd expect from a drafty farmhouse settling, except the sound had persisted, steady and low, like a wounded animal trapped behind time-worn planks. Rebecca clicked off her siren and stepped into the hush, her boots crunching in the gravel under a Texas moon so bright it made the shadows sharper, hotter, as if they wanted to scorch you from the inside out. The house stood 3 rooms wide, 2 deep, its peeling white paint splintered like old bone. The windows glared back at her, dark eyes refusing to yield any hint of movement within. She flicked on her flashlight and crossed the small front porch, the boards creaking beneath her. Wait. The front door was locked tight, each bolt sliding smoothly into place, though the tenant's nameplate still swung dully in the breeze. Martinez. She tried the knob, then the small mail slot. Nothing. No answer. No sign of life. She knocked. First politely, then with rising insistence, the hollow echo of her fist against the wood sounding more desperate than she felt. After the third knock, she stepped back and shone her light through the nearest window. The glass was grimy, but not so much that she couldn't see the dim interior. Chairs sat half-pulled from the table, a kerosene lamp on the floor, its flickering. Flame drowned out by the moonlight. Nothing moved. No curtains billowed, no drift of dust in shifting air. But then she paused, because in the window pane her own face floated there, framed by shadow disembodied, pale in the moon's glare. Blinked. Her reflection should have mimicked her every move, frozen or fluid. But this face, Rebecca's eyes rimmed with weariness, was tilted at an impossible angle, the lips curling into something like a sneer, and the entire head hung limply from a noose woven into the brand new chandelier overhead in the parlor. The cord snapped at her gasp, a rough jolt that sent the chandelier swaying, the crystals tinkling like broken promises. The reflection didn't flinch. It rolled its head, eyes, following her as if she were a sinner on display. With a sudden snap, it winked one long, deliberate blink of an eye that belonged only to her, and yet wasn't. Rebecca's heart pounded as every rational thought she'd ever clung to unraveled. She yanked at her door handle again, jiggling it in a flurry of panic until the latch finally gave way. The door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing the parlor in exact disarray. Chairs tipped, the kerosene lamp extinguished, the chandelier hanging at a slight angle as though shifted by that unseen reflection. She stepped inside, boots scuffing over the worn hardwood. The air tasted of sweat and old wood, heavy with dust motes drifting through the weak beam of her flashlight. She advanced, keeping her weapon hand ready, senses screaming that something was very wrong. The noose itself swung gently, its frayed loops catching the thick layer of dust in the air. She moved closer until the beam of light illuminated the chandelier just as it had in the window. No body, no rope, only an empty loop hanging where the reflection had shown itself. A whisper, as if carried on the sigh of a breath, wound around. Her ears soft, urgent. Rebecca, it called, her own name breathed through a mouth that wasn't hers. The voice was her voice, drenched in sorrow but laced with contempt, coming from somewhere behind her. She twirled, flashlight slicing a cone of light through the gloom, illuminating the parlor walls in jagged rectangles. Her breath hitched, vision swimming, as movement flickered in the hallway beyond her own silhouette drifting down the hall with an ungainly, jerking gait, shoulders hunched. The shape paused, head cocking as if listening, and then turned, face obscured by shadow, but the shape was her shape, wore her uniform. She backed up, spine slamming into the wall, pistol hand trembling. The whisper came again, closer now, soft, as the rustle of dead leaves. "Come play," it said, and the voice sounded hungry. Rebecca forced herself to breathe, muscles screaming to run, but the door she'd entered through was gone, replaced by a solid wall of peeling plaster. The windows fell silent, no moonlight creeping in, the floorboards beneath her feet feeling suddenly slick, as though soaked through with something warm. She flicked her flashlight around, catching the shape of her reflection again in a gouged mirror propped against the far wall. This time, the figure hung from the chandelier in the glass, feet brushing the floor, skin gray and drawn, eyes empty pits. The chandelier above the mirror was intact, no noose. Then both mirror and body shattered, glass spraying the room in jagged petals that sank into her boots. But the reflection remained, smiling from the frame of broken shards. A chill raced up her spine as her knees buckled. The parlor door slammed, shut somewhere behind her, a finality that snapped her psyche. She hurled herself forward, stomping on the glass, stumbling through the shards toward the hallway where she'd seen the shape. The corridor was impossibly long, stretching off into inky blackness lit only by the fading beam of her dying flashlight. With each step, her own whispering footsteps matched the pace of another set, a phantom echo. Rebecca kept running until the beam caught a doorway at the far end. She kicked it open and spilled onto a cold concrete floor. The walls lined with metal lockers, fluorescent bulbs overhead flickering to life. A school gymnasium, long abandoned, its ceiling latticed with rusting beams. She slammed the door behind her, dust clouds billowing in her wake. She raised her flashlight to the bleachers, the rusted metal planks dark against the shifting light. Then she saw them, rows upon rows of nooses, each loop empty, swaying in unison with the stale breeze. And there, on the bleachers, wearing her uniform, sat her reflection, swinging his legs and smiling. He waved, lifting one hand in a slow salute before letting it drop to his side. The whisper followed, "Sit with me." Rebecca tried to scream but found no voice. She dropped her flashlight, the beam skittering across the floor and landing on her boots. Her doppelganger stood and began to step down the bleachers, each movement graceful and predatory. Her blood numbed, her feet immobile as he closed the distance. She felt his breath on her cheek when he reached her, smelled that cold tang of fear amplified, and then he tilted her head back, hands like ice on her skull. She saw with her eyes what she already knew. Her fate had dissolved into the promise of that wink, and somewhere behind them, the ancient house waited, its windows itching to catch the next reflection that would hang itself from the chandelier. The first time I saw that drawing, I thought it was some kid's idea of a joke. Just a crude scrawl of stick figures and two big heads, drawn with that thick, waxy crayon they sell in 5-cent packs at the Dollar General. I was parked outside, the old Cottonwood trailer park, when I spotted it, taped to my cruiser's passenger door with a single strip of Scotch tape. The picture showed me, my uniform, my badge, that gleaming brown cruiser half buried up to my shoulders in what looked like a rectangular grave. Above it was a crudely drawn sun, but instead of gentle rays, they looked like prison bars, as though the bright orb itself were a cage. Beneath me, the earth was colored in dark reds and browns, smeared in a way that made it look like clotted flesh. Along the bottom, in uneven childlike letters, the phrase "I'm sleeping" was scrawled, as if to mock the idea of rest. I laughed when I peeled it off, laughed like a man whose laughter was a shield. I thought maybe it was some punk stunt, a prank born of boredom and cheap thrills. But later that night, as I sat in the darkness of my living room, the picture's lines winked behind my eyelids. I dreamt I was down in that grave, inhaling damp dirt while cold stones rattled overhead. I woke choking on air, sweat cold on my back, convinced I'd sliced my cheek on the badge pinned to my chest. The next morning, I scrubbed it at my uniform in the shower, counting the tiles slick with soap, and tried to convince myself that job-broken taillights, loose septic tanks, drunks who mistook my cruiser for their personal confessional was nothing more than routine. My partner, Harris, didn't seem to notice anything amiss, even when I brushed past him in the bullpen, and heard him mutter, "Hell of a night, Lee. You okay?" I grunted something unintelligible. Avoiding his eyes by dusk, I was out on patrol again, weaving through the back roads of Coleman County, where the pine trees stood like silent sentinels and the moonlight hit the asphalt in silver strips. I passed the creek where the old man Jennings said he heard children singing in the reeds, and I told myself I wouldn't stop for idle tailies. I flicked the siren on for a second just to shake off the tension, was rounding the bend by the abandoned motel shuttered windows like empty eye sockets when I saw it. Another drawing, taped to my rearview mirror. This one was different. It was drawn in what looked like fresh blood. The crayon wax was streaky and thick, and the color was darker, almost black at the edges, like it had soaked into the paper and bled through. It showed me again, buried alive, but my hands were clawing at the edges of the grave, nails caked. In earth and something darker. Behind me stood a figure in a nurse's uniform, face blank and bulbous eyes unblinking. Beneath the drawing, in letters that might have been traced one careful stroke at a time, it read, "Don't wake me." My heart hammered so hard I thought I could hear it through the cruiser's speakers. I yanked the sketch off and let it flutter to the passenger seat. I glanced around, no cars, not even a coyote in the ditch. The world was still, unnaturally so, as though the night itself held its breath. I turned the key in the ignition, but the engine sputtered, stalled, then died. My hand slipped on the wheel. I remember stepping out into the cool air and standing there with the door open, staring at the drawing, feeling the blood beat up in my throat. The cruiser's headlights cast long fingers across the empty highway, and behind me, the pines shivered. I got back in and tried again twice, and each time the engine went dead. My radio crackled to life with static, then a child's giggle so high-pitched it grated on my teeth. No words, just that pure ringing laugh. I pulled out my phone and dialed dispatch, but all I got was clicking, like someone tapping their fingernails on a desk. My voice shook when I said, "This is Deputy Lee. I need a tow. I think someone's messed with my cruiser." The dispatcher cut me off mid-sentence with a raspy whisper, "Don't wake him." Then a click, and dead. Panic choked me. I reached for my flashlight and stepped out, closing the door softly behind me. The air was thick with the smell of pine sap and something metallic. I scanned the tree line, no movement. My boots crunched on gravel as I walked to the hood of the cruiser, pried it open, and glanced inside. Nothing. No wires cut. No tools left behind. Everything looked factory. A breeze rattled the side mirror, and that's when I saw hands, small, pale hands, fingertips, pressed against the glass from the passenger side. I spun, flashlight swinging, but the light caught nothing. No body, no footprints, just empty blackness. I shook my head, telling myself it was animal or wind, shadows playing tricks. My collar felt tight, chest heavy, as though something sat on my rib cage. I climbed back in, slamming the door. The drawing lay on the seat, edges curling. I grabbed it and stuffed it into my jacket pocket, hurried back to the driver's side, and tried the key again. The engine roared to life. I peeled out onto the highway, tires squealing, heart pounding. I looked in the mirror and nearly choked. The drawing was back on the passenger door, blood edges glistening. I yanked the wheel, fish-tailed, straightened. Just in time to see a small silhouette dart across the road, too small to be a deer, too fast to be anything living. I drove back to town as fast as I dared, the cruiser's lights bouncing off the pines like frantic Morse code. In my rearview mirror I glimpsed movement, long hair, pale skin, but when I turned to look, the seat was empty. I screeched into the lot at the sheriff's office, killed the engine, radio still whispering static. Harris came running out, gun drawn. "Jason, what the hell?" I yanked open the door and stumbled out, cutting him off. "Look," I held up the heavy paper. The blood had already begun to darken, drying at the edges. His eyes went wide. "Where'd you get this?" he asked, voice tight. "Doesn't matter." I wiped at the smear on my fingers and realized it wasn't blood at all, but red clay mixed with oil, slick and greasy. Shaking, I tore another piece of paper from my notepad, laid it against the drawing, and stared. The lines were identical, but the letters read, "Help me." A sound like a child sobbing, soft and somewhere behind us, froze us both. We spun, flashlights raised into the night. Across the gravel lot, near the service doors, a little girl stood in a frayed yellow dress, knees dirty, face streaked with tears. She stared at us, eyes black pits, mouth twisting into a grin too wide for her tiny head. She raised a hand, pointed at the cruiser. The engine idled, lights flickering. In the glow, I saw muddy handprints streaking across the hood, as though someone inside had pounded at the glass. I froze, mouth dried out. She giggled, a sound like broken glass. Then she ran straight at me, but before I could react, she vanished behind the building. The sobbing grew louder, echoing off the steel siding, and I realized it wasn't coming from the girl but from under the ground. A wet, gurgling cry. On instinct, I ran to the back of the cruiser, tore the paper off my jacket, and held it out. The child's drawing me in the grave fluttered in the breeze. Beneath the surface of the asphalt, a crack split open, long and jagged, like a mouth pried wide. From its depths rose a hand, pale and thin, nails caked with earth. It grasped at the air, then another, until a small body climbed out into the moonlight. The girl from the drawing, face smeared with clay and something darker. She landed on her feet, head lolling unnaturally to one side. Her eyes met mine, hollow, endless. She put a finger to her lips in a shushing gesture, and the air filled with the hiss of dirt sliding back into the crack. The ground sealed itself so fast I would have sworn I imagined it, except for the trembling in the asphalt and the faintest imprint of tiny shoes in the gravel. Then she smiled. I heard Harris scream behind me, a wordless sound of pure terror. And when I turned back, the girl was gone, the cruiser's engine cut off, headlights dead, drawing of blood-flaked paper limp in my hand. And across the side of the cruiser, written in fresh earth, were the words, "See you soon?" I tossed the drawing to the ground and ran. Down the highway, past the motel, past the creek where Jennings claimed to hear children, and I didn't stop until I hit the city limits of Coleman. I left my cruiser by the roadside, badge still pinned to my chest, and got into an Uber. I told them to drive, any direction but back. Now I sit here in a cheap motel room in Abilene, the lights on low, eyes fixed on the door. I haven't slept. Every time I close my eyes, I'm down in that grave, lungs full of dirt, the nurse watching me from above. The cracked TV plays static, and the bed frame groans like a coffin lid. Outside, I hear footsteps in the parking lot, soft, small. I open the door just a crack, but no one's there. Only a breeze that carries the scent of pine and the faintest whisper, "Don't wake me." The moon lay low and heavy over Devil's Gate Airfield, its pale light spilling across cracked tarmac and the silent skeletons of hangars long since abandoned. Lieutenant Angela Patterson eased her cruiser onto the main strip, headlights cutting. Narrow paths through the fog that crept across the ground like 1,000 restless fingers. She'd heard the rumors, half-whispered accounts of midnight flights, phantom engines roaring through an empty night. Tonight, she was here to see for herself. The air smelled of oil and rust and something colder, something metallic and ancient. She clicked off the engine and stepped out, boots crunching on shattered glass and loose gravel. The runway stretched before her, a black ribbon leading straight into the belly of the night. Angela scanned with a flashlight. The beam quivered against the hangars, giant steel mouths waiting to swallow whatever dared approach. She ran a hand over the grip of her service revolver, though she doubted it could do much against whatever prowled this place. The wind shifted, carrying a distant thrum, a pulse building beneath her skin. It was a low, insistent vibration. Like a heartbeat echoing through steel dot, she started forward, flashlight slicing through the mist. Every footstep sounded a drumbeat in the hush. Above her, the skeletal remains of old control towers loomed, windows like dead eyes staring down. Angela thought she heard a faint hiss, a whisper of displaced air, and froze. Her breath fogged in the beam's circle. The tarmac ahead wavered as if breathing. Then, without warning, a spotlight flickered to life. Half a mile down the runway, a circle of brilliant white that revealed the shape of a jet sitting perfectly centered. The metal gleamed like a shark's back under moonlight. No pilot in sight, no ground crew, nothing but the cold, humming air and a terrible expectation. She swallowed hard and lifted her radio. "Dispatch, this is Patterson. Confirmed jets are grounded. Over." Her own voice sounded small. There was silence, then static crackle. "No flight plans for Devil's Gate tonight. Stay safe, Lieutenant." The response drifted away, leaving only the hush. The jet's engines roared into life with monstrous suddenness, a sound that rattled her bones. She stumbled back as the turbine blades rumbled, roaring like damned souls chained in iron drums. Plane began to taxi forward, gliding down the runway without a pilot's guiding hand. Its landing lights pierced the night, carving elongated shadows of broken hangar doors and collapsed fuel tanks. Angela raised her flashlight, trying to catch movement in the cockpit, but saw only darkness behind the glass. Then a face appeared, pressed against the windshield. She blinked and advanced, heart galloping, torn between the urge to run and the compulsion to witness. The face was porcelain white, hollow-eyed, its grin impossibly wide. The skin had peeled away in places, revealing bone and a row of chipped, jagged teeth. It stared at her, empty sockets burning with moonlight. Angela fumbled her radio again, shaking. What the hell is that?" The plane kept rolling, wheels grinding on tarmac as if drawn by some unseen hand. The night air bent around its passage, clouds churning overhead. She wanted to scream, but her voice lodged in her throat. She retreated toward a hangar's shadow, crouching behind a rusted fuel drum. Her pulse drummed in her ears, each beat louder than the last. The jet passed her hiding spot, its roar intensifying, and she braced against the hangar's corrugated wall. The windows rattled. She could feel its heat as it accelerated down the length of the strip. Then, a roar like a tornado's wrath, and the giant craft slammed into the far wall of the hangar. Metal twisted, concrete exploded. Flame and debris spat skyward in a spray of sparks. The blast wave slammed into Angela, knocking her off her feet. She skidded across the gravel, ears ringing, tasting ash in her mouth. For a heartbeat she lay. There, heart thundering, ears filled with ringing and the distant groan of bent steel. She scraped herself upright, legs trembling, and crawled toward the wreck. Smoke billowed in thick curls, lit from within by glows of ignition. The hangar's roof sagged, windows spiderwebbed with cracks. The jet's nose was buried in rubble. The fuselage lay splayed like a wounded beast. Engines hissed and sighed as they cooled, valves clicking like bone fragments. Angela risked a closer look. Through the shattered cockpit window, she saw the pilot, or what was left of him. The skull face lay crumpled over the controls, bone fragments mixed with sinew and scraps of uniform. Its jaw hung slack, teeth glinting. One skeletal hand clutched the stick, fingers broken but locked in a final, desperate grip. The other hand dangled lifeless, phalanges pointing at her, accusing her of trespass. A pool of dark, oily fluid seeped out, mingling with leaking hydraulic oil on the floor. She rose to her full height, pistol drawn, breath ragged. The smoke curled around her, carrying an acrid stench that stuck in her lungs. She wanted to take aim to fire into that ghastly skull, but her instinct screamed in protest. This was no living target. This was something else, something that should not be. The console's lights flickered in the haze, indices blinking like dying hearts. Then the cockpit lit up brighter, a sudden flare of electrical discharge. Angela's. Teeth rattled as a voice, distant and hollow, emerged from the wreckage. It sounded like wind through tombstones. A low moan that shaped itself into words, "Fly with me." She staggered back, tripping over debris, mind recoiling. The jets. Engines coughed, then died, leaving the night eerily silent. The hangar settled with a groan, as if it too had been wounded. The moon slipped behind a cloud, plunging the scene into darkness. Angela fumbled her flashlight and flicked it on, the beam trembling as she panned across the wreck. A sudden movement caught her eye. One of the empty eye sockets of the skull face lit up, a pinpoint of phosphorescent green. She screamed, pistol clattering to the ground, and vaulted back toward her cruiser. Behind her, the hangar gave a long, tortured creak, then collapsed inward with a thunderous crash that shattered windows and sent a cloud of dust rolling down the runway like a silent wave. The world tumbled into echoes of twisted metal and dying dust. Angela sprinted, feet pounding the tarmac, adrenaline burning through her. The cruiser's lights were a beacon in the oppressive black. She slammed open the driver's door, slid in, and gunned the engine. Tires skidded on loose stones as she peeled away, the broken hangar disappearing in her rear view. The round moon re-emerged, casting the jet's reflection in her side mirror. There on the road stood that grin of bone, skull face turned toward her, its empty sockets watching, waiting. She floored the accelerator, the engine shrieking, and didn't stop until Devil's Gate was miles behind. But even then, she could not shake the vision. That ancient pilot, that grin carved in death, the whip of flame and collapse. The night air in her lungs tasted of ash and something older than time. And somewhere out there, beneath that moon, the promise echoed in her mind. Fly with me, ... She broke into a cold sweat, knuckles white on the wheel. The road lights blurred, and the world narrowed to a single thought. Some flights never end. Officer Carlos Ortiz first heard about the mutilations in the dry static of his radio, the dispatcher's voice crackling with confusion under the July heat. Cattle prized longhorns more than a century old found gutted in their pastures. Organs removed with surgical precision. No tracks but the hoof prints lodged deep in the red clay. Ortiz wiped sweat from his brow as he steered his patrol truck off the highway onto the ranch road, its headlights carving tunnels through the dust that hovered like ghost motes in the air. He knew this part of Texas, the land stretching flat. For miles, broken only by the skeletal remains of mesquite and the occasional corral of rusted barbed wire. But tonight felt different, hushed, as if the world itself held its breath. He climbed out of the truck at the edge of the clearing, the horizon a dull line of black against an indifferent sky. His boots sank into the earth where the cattle had been found, the air heavy with the coppery stink of blood and the faint whisper of insects gathering. He knelt, flashlight in one hand, fingers brushing the dew of dried gore. The hoof prints formed a path leading away from the carcass, 3 jagged prints, each twice the size of a normal hoof, the edges worn smooth by weight. He rose, heart thudding, and followed that track deeper into the brush, the beam of his flashlight bobbing with each step, illuminating broken branches and half-buried bones. Every sense in Ortiz screamed to turn back. The night pressed in on him like hands, closing over his shoulders. He heard a low rumble, like the distant roll of thunder, but the sky was clear, no storm on the horizon. Still, something moved beyond his light, shifting in the shadows. He whispered to himself, "Come on, Carlos, it's just cows. Ranch dogs. We'll bark if something's near." But the silence was complete, sealed tight. No dogs, no birds, no wind in the mesquite leaves. Only the heavy pulse in his ears. The hoof prints converged in a small clearing ringed by limestone boulders mottled with lichen. Ortiz's light swept across the scene, and he froze. The cattle stood there on 2 legs, each one towering, impossibly tall, their bodies grotesquely elongated. Skin the color of old leather stretched over ribs that jutted like broken fence. posts. Their heads were those of longhorns, but their eyes glowed red, thrust forward in the circle of their skulls like coals. They held their heads high, nostrils flaring as though testing the air, and when Ortiz stumbled backward, they tilted theirs in unison, their gaze locking onto him. He swallowed, voice caught in his throat. They made no sound, but the ground trembled beneath his boots. He tried to call for backup, thumb frozen on the radio button, but only static answered. The creatures shifted then, a terrible, mechanical motion, knees bending, bodies balancing in a sway that echoed a twisted dance. The beam from his flashlight caught each of them in turn, silvering the sheen of their hides, the hollows of their cheeks, the way their tongues flicked out like black ribbons. And then they began to advance. Ortiz screamed and turned, sprinting. Through the brush, branches slapping his arms, thorns tearing his shirt. Above him, the night sky was a cruel patchwork of stars, indifferent to his terror. His flashlight swung wildly, sometimes illuminating a looming shadow, sometimes nothing, but empty darkness. The rumble grew louder, a chorus of hoofbeats pounding the earth faster than any human could run. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw them. They were close, maybe 20 yards away, towering shapes moving as one, eyes burning like coals in the night. He burst through the edge of the clearing, chest heaving, lungs on fire. The ranch house lay a quarter-mile away. Windows dark, no sign of life. The dirt road stretched behind him like a promise of salvation, but as he ran, the road itself seemed to stretch, pulling away until the house was a distant rectangle of black. Ortiz's legs burned with exhaustion, and doubt curled in his mind. What if this was no ordinary threat? What if the earth had birthed something unholy here? Something beyond his understanding? His chest tightened, and fear clouded his mind, making each thought heavy and slow. Abruptly, his foot caught a rut in the road, and he crashed to the ground, hands skidding in the dust. Pain shot up his arm, white-hot, but he didn't stay down. He rolled, scrambled back to his feet, and limped forward, adrenaline propelling him beyond the agony. Behind him, the footsteps stopped, an abrupt silence that tore at his nerves more than the chase. Ortiz risked another look. The creatures had reached the clearing's edge but halted there, bodies framed by the moonlight, watching. Their eyes glowed, tiny pinpricks of malice. Then they tilted their horns, lowering them in unison, as if bowing. And from the circle of boulders came a low, rumbling chant, a sound so ancient and warped that Ortiz felt the marrow in his bones tremble. He wanted to scream, to cry out for mercy, but no sound emerged. His mouth was dry, sandpaper rough. The chant rose, 1,000 throats chanting in a language older than the land itself, and the red lights in the creature's eyes grew brighter until Ortiz could not look. Something in him snapped fear, despair, the knowledge that he was marked. He turned and ran blindly into the darkness beyond the road, away from the clearing, away from the whispering chant. His senses numbed. He felt only the pounding of his heart and the thundering of hooves behind him once more as they followed. The night wrapped him in velvet darkness. His flashlight lay forgotten in the dust, its beam long since extinguished. He ran on instinct, memories of barbed wire fences and mesquite thorns flashing in his mind until the ground beneath him shifted. He crashed forward, rolled, scrambled up, and kept going, legs pumping, lungs burning. The hoofbeats were closer now, a steady drum in his chest. Each breath was agony, each heartbeat the last. Then he saw lights, a dim glow at the end of a slope. Headlights of a passing truck, maybe, or the porch light of a neighboring ranch. Hope blazed in his chest. He limped toward it, arms outstretched for salvation. And as he neared the source, the lights flickered and died as if the land itself had swallowed them. The silence returned, deeper now, suffocating. Ortiz stumbled forward until he collapsed against a fence post, muscles spent, vision swimming. He closed his eyes, expecting agony, death, relief, anything. Instead, there was only the faintest brush of something against his shoulder, a wet, fetid breath warm and animal nuzzling his ear. He froze, every nerve raw. The breath drew away, and in that moment, Ortiz knew he had crossed a line from which no man returned. He felt the slow, wet trail of drool along his neck, tasted metal in the air, and heard a single word whispered in his mind, not spoken aloud but pressed into his thoughts like ice. Join. He struggled to rise, but limbs failed him. The darkness pressed in, alive, suffocating. In the silence that followed, there was only the faintest echo of hoofbeats fading into the night. And then nothing, no wind, no insects, no bird song, only the land, silent and waiting as though the world held its breath once more. Officer Carlos Ortiz never returned to the highway. Ranchers found his patrol truck at dawn, engine running, doors open, but there was no sign of him, only a single set of two-legged hoof prints leading out into the clay, and then nothing beyond the horizon. Detective Mia Hernandez eased her cruiser down the narrow service road that snaked through the flat, rust-streaked expanse of the Texas-Louisiana Gulf Coast, the night sky smeared with oil-slick clouds that seemed to swallow what little light the distant rigs cast. She had answered the call at 2 a.m, the dispatcher's voice shaky with static, describing an explosion at Platform Delta 9 that had melted metal like candle wax, but left no visible debris, no twisted wreckage to mark the disaster. When she pulled up, the only illumination came from the churning mud pits and the flickering glow of dying flare stacks on neighboring rigs, their orange tongues guttering in the humid air. Her engine idled, the low hum echoing like a heartbeat in the stillness, and she stepped out, boots sinking into the knee-deep mire. The mud was thick and viscous, like congealed tar, and every footstep tugged at her ankle, pulling her deeper. She clicked on her flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness to reveal patches of slick residue that glistened like wet obsidian. The rig itself rose ahead, skeletal and black, its derricks bowed and brittle, yet it bore no sign of a blast, no scorch marks, no crumpled steel. Instead, the ground around it was stained with a substance that oozed and dripped, forming rivulets of dark ichor that vanished into the cracks between battered wooden planks. Her radio crackled to life, static giving way to a voice speaking in a guttural cadence, a rolling series of clicks and guttural vowels that made her skin crawl. She froze, the beam of her flashlight trembling in her hand. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language she recognized, no familiar inflection, no hint of anything human. The voice chattered on for several long seconds, then cut out, leaving. Only the hiss of the mud bubbling at her feet. Mia swallowed, the wet air thick in her lungs, and forced herself forward. With each step, slimy tendrils slithered across the ground, weaving between her boots. She shone the light on them, pale, translucent tubes no thicker than a garden hose, tapering to fine, hair-like tips that trembled as though alive. They writhed, as if reacting to her presence. Her heart thundered, but her training kicked in: observe, document, secure the scene. She clicked off her radio, silence flooding back, and knelt to shine her light on the mud dot. A tendril recoiled, coiling back into the muck, and another shot forward, touching the beam of light and retracting almost immediately. She pressed her gloved finger against the oozing substance, expecting a mess of oil or some chemical slick. Instead, the mud pulsed beneath her fingertip as if there were a heartbeat thrumming in the earth. She jerked her hand back, glove now sticky with a pea mountain, residue that clung with horrifying tenacity. It felt warmed up behind her. The rig's derrick groaned, metal twisting on its axis with a sound like labored breathing. She spun the flashlight upward, revealing the platform's undersides where beams of steel converged in tight clusters. From those beams dripped more tendrils, dozens of them, like the roots of some subterranean tree that had invaded the world of oil and machinery. They dangled, quivering and slow, their ends brushing the mud, leaving trails of that same warm, pulsing ichor. A low roar rolled across the swampy flats, unnatural and resonant, like a choir of deep-throated creatures singing beneath the sea. Mia's pulse raced. She kept her gaze fixed on the rig, unwilling to look away, as though the slightest flicker of her attention would permit whatever lived here to seize her. She fumbled for her phone, fingers slick, and recorded a voice memo. Her words clipped and urgent. Possible structural failure leads to unknown organism infiltration. Observe dripping tendrils. She cut herself off as the rig shuddered, sending a rain of sticky mud over her shoulders. She ducked beneath the overhang of a battered catwalk, mud splattering her hair and uniform. The roar rose, then fell silent, leaving the night alive with an expectant hush. Her flashlight picked out movement along the beams. Those tendrils had coalesced into a thick mass, crawling along the metal as though seeking something. They gathered at a joint, pressing against the steel until it buckled. With a sharp crack, the beam snapped and the rig jolted, as though coughing. A fresh torrent of mud gushed from the broken support, carrying more tendrils that writhed toward her in a sludgy wave. She scrambled backward, boots sliding, mud sucking at her legs. She yanked her service weapon free, chambering around with reckless urgency and firing into the mass. The slug tore through the center of the writhing tangle, but the tendrils merely recoiled, then surged forward to seal the wound. The mud itself bubbled and contracted, and the rig tilted with a roar, as though ready to collapse. Her phone crackled as dispatch came back online, voice brittle with static. She keyed her mic. "Get me the forensic team now. Evacuate this area." "I'm seeing." She hesitated, realizing no one would believe this. The tendrils quivered at the edge of her flashlight's beam, stretching toward her like eager fingers. She winced as another voice came through, distant and wrong, speaking that same alien tongue. She sensed rather than saw movement behind her, and spun to find an opening in the mud where something receded, something large, leaving a trough carved into the earth. Her breath caught. The opening was tall, easily 8 feet high, and framed by jagged chunks of steel and wood. Beyond it lay darkness solid enough to swallow her light. From within that void echoed low clicks, rhythmic and deliberate, like a heartbeat measured in bone. Somehow, the rig's explosion must have cleaved open a pocket, a threshold to something that had been waiting. A tremor ran through the mud, rippling outward. Mia realized with a jolt that the ground beneath her was shifting, sucking at her boots. She kicked free, stumbling onto firmer earth, her gun arm shaking so badly she nearly dropped the weapon. Behind her, the rig groaned again, steel girders creaking until one let go with a thunderous crack, sending a column toppling into the mud. It landed with a splash, the impact sending concentric waves of slush toward her. Mia turned and ran, heart hammering, mud spraying with each frantic stride. She could hear that voice behind her, chanting in that impossible language, and above it the wet slurping of tendrils extending across the ground like tributaries in a deluge. She leapt into her cruiser, breath ragged, and fumbled for the keys. The door slammed shut, and she jammed the ignition. The engine caught with a roar, tires spitting mud as she fishtailed back down the service road. In her rearview mirror, she saw the oil rig's derrick sway, then collapse in on itself, the flare, stacks extinguishing in a pitiless shower of sparks. But even as the heap of metal fell silent, the radio in her cruiser sputtered to life, and that voice whispered through the static, closer now, its cadence almost mournful. She slammed on the brakes, her pulse hammering, and the radio cut out. Drove on in heavy silence, mud spattering across the windshield, panting until the road straightened and she could push the gas to the floor. Behind her lay the corpse of platform Delta 9, but beneath the wreckage lay a scar in the earth, a wound that pulsed with an unseen life. And in that scar, something stirred, ready to speak in a language older than oil or steel, older than mankind itself. The highway was quiet that night, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums until your own blood sounds like a waterfall rushing through your veins. Sergeant Kevin Douglas had stopped at the little pull-off just past Cedar Creek Bridge, the only place for miles with a patch of gravel wide enough to accommodate the patrol car. He'd been chasing a stolen pickup through the black folds of roadside pines when the dashcam had picked up a flicker of motion ahead, something beside the road where nothing should be. He killed the cruiser's engine and stepped into the stillness, flashlight in hand, boots crunching on gravel that sounded too loud under the weight of the night. The beam cut through the darkness to reveal the shrine, a haphazard wooden cross driven into the ground, wrapped in thorny vines and littered with melted candle stubs, their wax pools like scar tissue on the dirt. Flames danced atop a half dozen. Candles set on a rough-hewn shelf, their light steady as if protected from wind or breath. Kevin frowned. The wind was dead calm, the air too warm for drafts. He felt the fine hairs on his forearms prick. Beneath the candle sat a laminated photograph, its edges curled with moisture. He knelt, lifted it, and froze. The face staring. Back at him was his own eyes hard, mouth set, and beneath it, someone had scrawled a date in black marker. July 9th, 2025. 3 days from now. He exhaled and rubbed his thumb across the laminate, expecting the ink to smear, but it remained crisp, mocking. His radio crackled and he dropped the photo, heart thumping. "Sergeant Douglas," his partner's voice said. "You out here?" "Yeah," he managed, tucking the photo into a pocket. "Found something odd. Shrine? That's it." He stood, shining the beam around. The night pressed against him, and for a moment he imagined shapes moving just beyond the light's edge. He backed to the cruiser, only to find another photo taped to the passenger window. Identical, except the date read June 30th, 2 days ago. Kevin's pulse shot up. He'd been here, but no shrine, no photos. He remembered checking the spot earlier, at least he thought he had, and seeing only darkness and gravel. Now, evidence that he'd been back, that someone knew exactly where to find him. His breath came fast. "Aye," he began, but the radio sputtered and died, leaving him in a bubble of silence. He started the cruiser and plucked the second photo free, heart pounding as he read the date. It was past. He took off his gloves, hands trembling, and stared at the photo. He recognized the line of the jaw, the slight scar above his eyebrow. From an old bar fight, but this image was too perfect, a prediction he couldn't escape. Lightning flashed behind the trees, not in the sky but low on the horizon, painting distant pines in fleeting gray. Kevin's eyes darted back to the shrine. The candles still burned, stubborn in the damp earth. He drove off without a word to dispatch, tires humming on asphalt, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror for headlights that never came. For 3 days, the photos haunted him. They appeared in his home one taped to the breakfast coffee maker, dated July 7th, the day he swore. He slept through a pager call and another slipped under his door at the precinct, dated July 8th, the next sunrise. He tore them up each time, only to find new ones, pristine as the day they were printed, always with his face and a date just ahead of him. He told no one, fearing they'd call him paranoid, or worse, insane. But sleep became impossible. In the dead hour before dawn, he scrawled notes in a battered notebook. Who? Why me? What happens on July 9th? His hand shook so badly the pen sputtered. On July 8th, His partner, Detective Ramirez, cornered him in the locker room. Kevin's hair was wild, his uniform rumpled. "You look like hell," Ramirez said. "You okay?" Kevin glared, then shoved the torn remnants of a photo onto the detective's locker shelf. "See for yourself." Ramirez picked through the strips of laminate, piecing together the photograph of Kevin's face framed by tomorrow's date. Ramirez turned pale. "Jesus," he whispered. "How? Whose? Playing this game?" "I don't know." Kevin's voice was hollow. "Something's coming." That night, Kevin couldn't bring himself to return to his apartment. Instead, he sat in the cruiser at the edge of town, parked under a street lamp that buzzed and flickered. The photo for July 9th lay on the dash, flashlight beside him like a talisman. Midnight approached, and with it, dread heavier than the air. He stared at the photo, then closed his eyes and willed the image to change. The face stayed the same, cold and determined. Finally, he opened his door, climbed out, and walked the few yards to the spot where he'd been 3 nights before. The shrine was gone, no cross, no candles, nothing but flat ground and dead leaves. He exhaled, a laugh trembling free. Relief or hysteria, he couldn't tell. His radio crackled. "Douglas?" It was dispatch. "You want that burglary you marked last night? They just called about gunshots. You okay?" He hesitated. "On my way," he lied, grabbed the photo, and turned back to the road. Halfway. There, the cruiser's lights dimmed, then died completely. He slammed his hands on the hood and the batteries sparked. The radio died again. Kevin fished in his pocket for keys and found a single candle, stubby and blackened at the wick. He'd never seen it before. He scrambled back to the vacant spot, heart pounding so hard he could taste it. The flame he struck against metal danced to life. Beneath it, pushed into the soil, was the shrine, cross, shelf, melted wax, and the laminated photo for July 9th. Only now the photograph's ink was fresh, the date leaping at him, and beneath it, another image he didn't recognize. A blurred shape, tall and humanoid, eyes black holes, mouth stretched wide in a grin that couldn't belong to any living thing. The candle guttered. Kevin felt the air thicken, the night grow further around the edges. He backed away, slipping in mud, and the candle fell, snuffing out with a hiss. In the darkness, something moved just beyond where his eyes could see. He raised his voice, a raw, ragged plea. "Who are you? What do you want?" The thing didn't answer. He heard a footstep, slow and deliberate, on soil too soft for human tread. His radio crackled. "Douglas?" It was Ramirez's voice. "Faint, where are you?" Kevin flicked on his flashlight, but the beam refracted, splitting into shards that painted the trees in bleeding shadows. He turned to run, but the thing was there, tall as a man, silhouette against the black, head tilted. It held out a hand. Long, spindly fingers ending in broken nails. Kevin tried to scream, but his throat locked. The creature's mouth flexed, revealing rows of serrated teeth. It stepped forward, and in its shadow, Kevin saw the date July 9th, 2025, etched into the ground in fresh blood. The creature's grin broadened. Kevin swung the flashlight, light slicing through darkness, but it passed through the thing like smoke. The creature leaned close, its breath a cold wind smelling of rot and rain. "Tomorrow," it whispered in a voice like cracking wood, "you belong to the shrine." The flashlight flickered and died, and Kevin fell to his knees as the creature's smile swallowed the night. The heat was a living thing, clinging to Alicia's fatigues as she climbed out of her cruiser and walked across the cracked asphalt of the church parking lot. It was close to midnight, but the air still shivered with warmth, thick and soupy under a sky smeared with smog and stars. She'd gotten the call 10 minutes ago. "You're clear to respond," crackled over the radio screams. Someone said, coming from St. Bartholomew's, but the dispatcher's voice had trembled. It was enough to make her blood hum with anticipation. Church loomed before her like a carcass, its whitewashed walls cracking and sagging, the steeple crooked against the sky as if it had seen too much. From outside, the windows were dark rectangles, glass smeared with nothing but shadow. She paused at the door, hand hovering over the frame. The screams had stopped. Inside, the air folded around her, cool as a tomb and dry as old bones. The floorboards creaked under her boots as she crossed the threshold, lightning bugs flickering through shattered stained glass, angelic figures in broken shards, wings blotted with black. She clicked on her flashlight, the beam splitting the darkness, illuminating the nave's empty expanses. At first, there was only emptiness, rows of wooden pews polished smooth by decades of worship, aisles wide and silent. But as she advanced, something caught her eye. Every pew, from front to back, was occupied. Not by living parishioners, but by skeletons, crisp and bleached white, each clad in the ragged remains of a uniformed police officers, firefighters, EMTs, chaplains. Their joints clicked softly when she passed, as if settling in their seats. Each skeleton clenched rosary beads in its bony hands, black-stained beads that glistened weightly under her flashlight, as though still dripping with tar. She forced herself to step closer. Her heart pounded in a slow drumbeat, echoing against the stone walls. The pews beside her were lined with more skeletons, each skull turned toward the altar, empty eye sockets fixed in eternal prayer. Dust motes swirled in her beam like restless spirits. The wooden floor felt slick beneath her. Though she knew it was polished and clean, she'd been here once before for a baptism. The smell of old incense clung to the air, sweet and nauseating. "Corporal Gomez," she whispered into her radio. "I'm inside." No sign of anyone alive. Static crackled back. Her radio seemed alive with distant whispers, indiscernible voices dancing behind the hiss. She swallowed and tightened her grip on her flashlight, sweeping the beam up the aisle to the altar. The crucifix hung high, Jesus' wooden body splintered, one arm missing. Beneath it, the altar cloth was torn in half, a seam of black beads. Leading from the steps into the congregation of skeletons, she took another step, and the floor shivered, or maybe her boots did. She exhaled, forced calm into her voice. She'd dealt with hallucinations before. The isolation of night and the flutter of adrenaline could play tricks. But something deeper hummed in the walls, a muted vibration like chanting far away. Alicia followed the trail of beads, careful not to slip. They curved around the pews, each set of beads forming a perfect circle in the dust beneath the skeletons. She reached the center of the aisle, where a pair of skeletal hands rested on the back of a pew. She knelt, bringing her face close to the black beads, and her breath caught when she saw how they pulsed, throbbing, as if alive. She inched her flashlight down, searching the floor at her feet. There was a dark stain forming, spreading in a slow bloom across the planks. It looked like oil, but as it crept closer, she recognized the sharp copper tang of blood. She felt bile rise in her throat. The chanting grew louder then, or perhaps that was her mind broken. It rose in a low, wordless like a choir of voices singing in half-heard Latin. The words were unfamiliar, jagged with something ancient and wrong. Alicia rose slowly, her hand slipping to her service weapon. She trained her flashlight across the pews again. The skeletons all leaned forward slightly, as if straining to watch her. She backed away, every muscle primed. The beads clattered when she moved too near, sparking tiny echoes. She thought she saw one skeleton tighten its grip on the dried rosary, jaw shifting in a whisper of bone against bone. Her stomach lurched. She aimed the flashlight at the altar and moved forward, stepping over the stain. The trail ended in a circle of black beads around the altar's base. On the altar lay an open Bible, its pages burned away in the center, leaving only scorched edges curled toward the missing words. Beneath the charred ruin, the stone surface was smooth and slick with something dark and glossy. She knelt again, scraping a fingertip across the residue. It lifted like thick varnish, but when she smelled it, she recognized it. Fresh sweat mingled with iron and decay. The chanting reached a crescendo. She sprang upright, shining her flashlight toward the choir loft at the back. The shadow there coalesced into figures more skeletons, perched on the edge of the loft, heads tilted. One raised a hand, its bony fingers beckoning. The beam of light trembled as her hand shook. She edged backward toward the entrance, thinking to call for backup. 10-4, I need an ambulance and floodlights. Now. But her radio died in her hand. No static, no life. Darkness swallowed the room beyond her flashlight's cone. A scratch echoed from the choir loft. She flicked the beam upward and caught sight of a uniformed skeleton pivoting, its socket eyes locked on her. It raised its rosary beads to its jawless mouth and tilted its skull in what she knew was a mocking bow. Her heart thundered against her ribs, as if desperate to break free. She turned and ran, boots pounding the creaking boards, beads clicking behind her as each skeleton shifted in its pew. She didn't dare look back. The hallway beyond the narthex was dark, but she sprinted through anyway, arms pumping, the smell of rot and smoke chasing her. She burst through the front doors into the night air, where cicadas screamed in the darkness. The parking lot's asphalt felt forgiving under her boots. She skidded to a halt beside her cruiser, fumbling with the door handle. The radio in her pocket crackled to life, her voice screaming over and over, "Get out, they're coming." But she had no breath to spare. She threw herself into the car, slamming the door shut. The interior light flickered on, revealing the passenger seat covered in something dark. She froze, chest heaving. Slowly, carefully, she eased the beam of her flashlight inside the cab. On the seat lay a single rosary, beads of polished black bone glistening with fresh blood. The crucifix at its end had been snapped off, a single, jagged spike of metal. She reached forward, hand trembling so violently she could hardly grip the beads. When her fingers closed around them, they slipped through her skin as though they were water, and she tore back, dropping the rosary onto the floorboard. The skeletons behind her began to laugh low, keening sounds that crawled under her skin. She floored the accelerator and the car shuddered, tires spinning on the tarmac before finally gripping. As she tore away from the church, she glanced in her rearview mirror. Through the windshield, framed by the glass, she saw them. The skeletons standing in the doorway, beads clutched to their chests, empty sockets gleaming as they sang their silent mass. The engine roared, the highway lights blurred, and Alicia Gomez rode into the night, every mile distancing her from St. Bartholomew's, but she could still hear the choir behind her, echoing in her mind, promising that the pews would never truly be empty again. Deputy Thomas Reed's boots thudded against the worn wooden planks of the bridge as he made his routine patrol under a moonless sky. The Rio Grande flowed beneath him like an endless ribbon of ink, its surface broken only by occasional eddies that sent ripples shimmering across the water. The air was thick with humidity, carrying the faint scent of mesquite and decay from the riverbanks. Somewhere downstream, crickets chirped in a frantic chorus, but here the only sounds were the echo of his own breath and the rhythmic creak of the old bridge's beams. He paused when he noticed footprints in the damp wood, bare footprints, oddly small, stepping toward the railing and then vanishing, as if someone had simply walked off the edge. He crouched, running a gloved finger along the prints and feeling the rough grain of the wood beneath his touch. Strange, he thought. Those Prince hadn't been there an hour ago when he'd made his first round. A shiver crawled up his spine, though the night was oppressively warm. He straightened, his hand slipping toward the pistol at his hip, and leaned over the railing, peering into the river's inky depths. The water gave nothing back, no flicker of movement, no shimmer of moonlight, no hint of what might have swallowed. Those footprints, Hole. He drew a slow breath and rose, turning to call into the darkness. Anyone back there? His voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the stillness. No reply came. He stepped forward, intending to chalk in the station log that he'd found evidence of trespassing or perhaps a prankster's handiwork. But before he could reach for his notebook, he felt a cold weight settling on his right shoulder, a pressure that felt as if a bony hand had closed around his uniform jacket. He froze, throat tightening. The hairs along his neck bristled as the hand squeezed, not roughly, but deliberately, as though testing his steadiness. He wanted to spin around, to rip at whatever had grasped him, but his legs felt rooted, every muscle refusing to obey. His breath caught in his throat and hung there, thick and heavy. Time slowed, and in that silence he became aware of something else, a low, bubbling sound coming from the river, like water boiling in a giant cauldron. He swallowed hard, barely daring to breathe, but the sound grew louder, a rolling, frothing churn that vibrated through the bridge's timbers and into his boots. He forced his gaze back to the water, and his heart lurched. The surface writhed with movement, something unseen pushing the river from below, creating waves that rose like the backs of monstrous beasts. Then, as though the black water had become a living maw, dozens of pale shapes broke through the surface, slender arms and pale hands scrambling for purchase on the bridge's underside. Their fingers were long and thin, too many joints bent at unnatural angles, and their skin glowed with a sickly phosphorescent sheen. They reached up, mouths gaping around rows of tiny, jagged teeth, and floated there in perfect silence. No hiss, no scream, not even a whisper of warning, just the silent mouths, fixed open as if awaiting a command. Reed's knees buckled, and he sank onto one foot, the pressure on his shoulder tightening. He flung a glance behind him, desperate to see what held him fast, but everything was swallowed by darkness. A single beam of moonlight slipped through a gap between the planks, illuminating the hand on his shoulder, pale, wet, with skin that looked stretched too tight over bone. No flesh stirred with warmth. It was as cold and dead as ice. He felt the fingertips curl, urging him forward toward the railing. Panic flared in his chest. He pried at the wrist with his free hand, tugging, pulling, but his fingers slid off the slick bone like water. The pressure increased, driving him forward until his face was inches from the rim. He could see the red glow of algae below, the rippling patterns of light dancing across the undersides of the bridge, that sickly glow matching the color of the lips that framed those silent mouths. His pulse pounded so hard he thought it might tear through his chest. He tried to shout, but his voice was nothing more than a croak. The creatures below had shifted, their bodies swirling like ink in water until they formed a single mass, a living column of pale, writhing shapes ascending toward him. He could no longer feel his legs. Terror had frozen them into useless stumps. He closed his eyes, braced himself for the plunge. In that moment, a second hand clamped onto the cuff of his uniform firm, alive, startlingly human. He flung his head back and saw her, a young woman, mud streaked across her cheeks, eyes burning with fierce determination. She wore a faded sundress plastered to her skin, and her long hair clung to her shoulders. Without hesitation, she yanked Reed backward, her grip iron strong, as though she drew strength from his fear. The dead hand on his shoulder unclenched and withdrew, vanishing into the rafters with a wet slur. The boiling water subsided in an instant, the creatures receding into the darkness below, and the bridge fell silent once more. Reed collapsed against the wooden railing, gasping as the woman knelt beside him, her eyes scanning the river. "Deputy Reed," she rasped, voice low but urgent, "you shouldn't be here." He looked up, blinking through tears of shock. "Who are you?" he managed. She met his gaze, face along the pale spectrum between youth and death. "I live downriver," she whispered. "They call me La Alma." Reed tried to stand but couldn't find his legs. She curled a hand around his elbow, steadying him. "You saved me once," she said. "Now I return the favor." He shook his head, stunned. "You? I saw you in the water." She cast her eyes downward. "You did. I couldn't reach you." She closed her eyes as though recalling something terrible. "Let's go." She helped him to his feet and guided him across the span, back toward solid ground. As they passed the spot where the footprints ended, Reed's eyes flickered to the railing. There, a row of tiny footprints was pressed into the wood once more, leading toward land, not water small as a child's, imprinting hope instead of despair. Reed swallowed hard, voice trembling. "They follow me." She shook her head once, a gesture of both sorrow and resolve. "No," she said softly. "You follow them." Together they stepped off the bridge, Reed's heart still pounding in a frantic hammering, and the woman led him toward the riverbank. Behind them, the bridge lay silent beneath the starless sky. But Reed knew, looking back over his shoulder, that silence was only a cover for the things that moved unseen, waiting for the next foolhardy soul to wander too close to the dark, boiling waters of the Rio Grande. Lieutenant Vanessa Cruz remembered the day she first set foot in the old asylum on the outskirts of Terlingua. The concrete wings of the building bathed in a dusty gold as the sun sank behind the Chizos Mountains. The place had been abandoned for decades before a wealthy collector turned it into a museum of the macabre, displaying relics of the patients who once roamed its halls. Now it attracted thrill-seekers and true crime aficionados. But Vanessa was there on duty, tasked with patrolling the galleries after hours an empty castle of whispers and shadows. Her flashlight beam cut a narrow swath through the darkness. As she walked the perimeter of the main gallery, where rows of oil portraits lined the walls. Each canvas held the face of a former inmate, eyes hollow or wild, features frozen in anguish or despair. What unnerved Vanessa most was how the painting seemed to blur and shift if you stared too long, as though the faces were breathing, the paint alive. She chalked it up to fatigue and the mind's tendency to play tricks in low light. She passed a portrait of a gaunt woman known only as Martha, whose hair had once been coal-black. Tonight, strands of silver threaded through. The artist's brushwork spoke of age, but Vanessa recalled seeing Martha's file. She had died at 23. A shiver passed through her. The next painting was of an elderly man with a stooped back, his lined face tugged with sorrow. Vanessa remembered his record. He'd been in his 30s, never older than 40. As she moved on, she could have sworn. The man's mouth had curled into a frown that hadn't been there seconds before. She reached the inner foyer, where visitors entered through a grand archway into the building's former center. Here, beneath a cracked skylight, hung the newest acquisition, a portrait painted only last week by an anonymous artist. It depicted the foyer itself, every detail rendered with uncanny precision, the chipped marble floor, the tarnished brass railings, the stained glass window above the double doors. And behind a pane of glass within the painting, displayed on a simple plinth, lay the lifeless form of Lieutenant Vanessa Cruz, clad in her uniform, eyes staring sightlessly toward the viewer. Her breath hitched, and the beam of her flashlight trembled as she trained it on that disquieting image. She hammered her pulse with her mind, forcing herself to look away, to leave. but her feet stayed rooted. She lifted a gloved hand to the painting's surface, smooth, cool to the touch. No frame jutted from the wall. The image bled into the plaster as though it had grown from the building's bones. She backtracked down the corridor, her footsteps echoing against the stone like ominous drums. Each time she glanced over her shoulder, she half expected to see herself, corpse-like and still, in some other display, but the halls were empty. The air felt thick, like walking through water, pressing against her lungs. A distant drip of water from a rusted pipe punctuated the silence dot at the security desk. She checked the panel. Cameras in the east wing flickered with static, and one feed showed the silhouette of a figure standing in front of the foyer painting. She frowned. No one was supposed to be here. She used the intercom to radio dispatch, but only static answered. The overhead lights flickered, and for a moment the museum plunged into darkness. Instinctively, she braced herself against the desk. When the lights snapped back on, the air had grown colder. Her breath misting in front of her dot, she moved according to protocol, heading toward the east wing to investigate. The corridor was narrower there, the walls lined with rusted medical equipment chains. Restraints, jars filled with cloudy fluid. The portraits became more grotesque. Bodies twisted in unnatural shapes, eyes gouged out, mouths sewn shut. Vanessa forced herself not to linger, reminding herself that these were merely paintings, macabre props in a museum, but then she arrived at the last gallery, the one reserved for the asylum's most infamous inmates. The door creaked as she pushed. It opened. Inside, the portraits hung in an impossible circle, 6 canvases facing inward like sentinels. The flash of her beam caught on polished glass 6 pairs of eyes turned toward her, and in each painting, the figures' heads tilted slightly, as though acknowledging her presence. A low hum rose from the floor, vibrating through her boots. She swallowed hard, the hum swelling until it drowned out her thoughts. The paintings began to shimmer, the faces blurred and elongated, stretching toward her with silent mouths opening. She stumbled backward, tripping over the threshold and falling hard onto the stone floor. Her radio skittered across the tiles and fell silent. The hum ceased in an instant, replaced by a heavy, oppressive quiet. Vanessa dared to lift her head. One by one, the portrait's painted eyes blinked. 6 slits of color in the varnish winked. Shut, and the canvases went blank white, the faces washed away. Her chest tightened in alarm. What had she broken? She scrambled to her feet and fled down the corridor, heading back to the foyer. The foyer was deserted except for the single painting of her corpse. But now, another portrait hung beside it, small and unframed, like a torn page from a sketchbook. She crossed the room, heart thundering, and illuminated the new image. It was a charcoal sketch of her car, parked in the museum lot, doors open, engine idling. Behind the wheel sat a figure she recognized herself, pale and still, eyes glassy. The temperature plunged. Vanessa saw her breath swirl before her mouth and felt the hairs on her arms stand on end. The painting's surface rippled like water. From somewhere above, a soft thump echoed. She raised her light to the cracked skylight. A black shape pressed against the glass, low and spreading, something alive and crawling, until a hand-long, thin fingers ending in cruel talons slid into view. She screamed, dropping the flashlight, its beam scattering across the floor. The door behind her slammed shut, and the skylight cracked, raining shards of glass down into the circle of portraits. She dove to the side, pulling herself backward until her back hit the wall. In the shards of broken skylight, she saw the reflected images of all the portraits in the museum, their faces alive again. Staring at her with hunger. The hand withdrew, and in that instant of calm, Vanessa bolted straight for the main entrance. She yanked at the doors, but they held fast. She pounded on them, her uniform shoulders slamming into the wood. The museum groaned as if waking from a nightmare. Floorboards creaked above her, and then the thud of boots. Her own boots, pacing. Along the balcony overlooking the foyer, she heard her name whispered, Lieutenant Vanessa. The voice was hers, wavering, disembodied. She pressed her face to the glass of the doors, searching for any sign of rescue, but the windows showed only black night outside. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. Vanessa. Vanessa. Behind her, the foyer painting shimmered again, and the image of her corpse blinked. The dead figure lifted a hand in a beckoning gesture. Vanessa's breath caught, and for an agonizing heartbeat, she felt herself drawn toward it. Then the doors shuddered and burst open from the outside, someone kicking them in. Floodlights from the patrol car blazed through the foyer, illuminating her trembling form. She stumbled into the arms of responding officers as the museum's doors swung wide. Behind them, the building went silent, the portraits all blank. The skylight lay in shards on the floor, and the arc of broken glass on the foyer wall traced the shape of a handprint. Vanessa didn't look back as they led her away. In her pocket, her flashlight lay cold, its beam dead. But she could still hear the whisper, soft as a breeze through the cracked glass. Lieutenant? Vanessa.